Gracie Doolin's final Mythology Project for the 2023 fall semester at Truman State University. Introduction. I began this project intending to illustrate the reconstruction of the vampire myth and the lore associated with it in the past century, or, more specifically, the reimagining the monster underwent between the 1897 novel Dracula by Bram Stoker and the 2005 novel Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. These books were written 108 years apart, and the shift vampires and vampire literature experienced across that time period is palpable. Though originally I intended to create a detailed timeline describing the rise of vampires in literature to the infamous Count Dracula, the tonal shift of vampires and what they represented in Anne Rice's series The Vampire Chronicles, and finally ending with Twilight, that undertaking seemed too great and, to be honest, not as interesting as what I really wanted to write about. Thus, having decided against creating a timeline, I opted to write my half-creative, half-analytical project instead. I wanted to rewrite a portion of Dracula with Stephenie Meyer's Edward Cullen starring as the vampire of the book, and a portion of Twilight with Bram Stoker's Dracula taking the place of Edward. I've made edits in order to showcase the differences between each vampire in one chapter that the novels both take upwards of 400 pages to illustrate. While not entirely comprehensive, I believe the swapping of stories best exhibits how this mythological creature could be so varied. I have written notes for annotations and explanations as to certain changes. Anything lifted word for word from the text is put in quotations. Also important to add, Edward's character and the practices or origins associated with him are pulled solely from Twilight, not the entire series by the same name. Time and the sheer size of content matter, over 2,500 pages in the entire book series, would not allow such an endeavor, so only the characteristics the audience encounters in the first book will be used for Edward. For posterity's sake, I want to add my own personal biases. I did not particularly like either of these books. Frankly, the treatment of women, xenophobia, and questionable uses of religion in either or both of these books were palpable. However, I can acknowledge that both have merits to them as well. How else would they have sold millions of copies and become arguably the most recognizable pieces of vampire literature in the world? And while I initially set out to prove how different Dracula and Edward Cullen were, I found as I read that the concept they both represented was actually the same. The way in which Stephenie Meyer and Bram Stoker framed the drinking of blood were both representations of sex. However, the way it is portrayed varies. This is what I hope to illustrate in the following stories. Finally, please remember that these stories are not supposed to work. Dracula will not work if the sparkly, angsty teenage Edward Cullen occupies the Count's role. Twilight will not work if the elderly Eastern European Dracula inhabits Edward's role. The point of these stories is not to rewrite the books in a way that will lend itself to a full novel, but to examine what purpose Edward serves to the teenage girls that read about him, and what purpose Dracula served to the Victorian adults who read about him. These two are different characters from different stories with different purposes. Our question must simply be, how are they different and why? With that in mind, I hope the Dracula rewrite makes you laugh, and I hope the Twilight rewrite makes you uncomfortable. It certainly was amusing and chilling for me to write respectively. Dracula Rewritten. Jonathan Harker's journal kept in shorthand. 3rd of May, Bistritz. Mina and I left Munich at 8:35 p.m., May 1st, arriving at Vienna early the next morning. Footnote 1. The first edit I felt was necessary was to present Jonathan and Mina as a married couple from the beginning so they can travel together without scandal. Edward requires a woman to interact with fully to display his character, thus the addition of Mina to Jonathan's trip. I proposed to Mina that we explore Budapest a bit, despite my better judgment. I did not wish to stray far, lest we miss the train. However, I still felt twinges of guilt every time I looked at Mina on the journey, regretful that I was compelled to transform our honeymoon into a business trip. Footnote 2. I also framed Jonathan's previously solo business trip as their honeymoon so as to make the addition of Mina to a business trip appear more natural. Mina, in all her angelic goodness, never complained about the duality of our trip and even recognized that an outing into town would be unwise. Footnote 3, Mina's praises are sung throughout the novel as she is constantly ranked as the first of all women by Jonathan and Van Helsing. Mina compares herself to other women as well, claiming she is not of the hysteric, fainting type and wishes only to be of use to the vampire hunters. Bella Swan and Mina are quite similar in many regards, one such extreme instance being when they both are victims of attempted or successful sexual assault. They actually comfort the protective males in their life who are so rageful and sorrowful about the attack that they are not emotionally available enough to comfort the actual victims. Sexual violence against women being framed as an attack by bad men that affects good men instead of an attack on women is simply one instance of the poor treatment or complete erasure of women in both of these novels, but I digress. We settled ourselves with a brief stroll through the streets. Then we left in pretty good time and came after nightfall to Klausenburg, where we stopped to stay at the Hotel Royal. I found what little German I knew to be very useful here. Indeed, I believe Mina and I would have been quite lost without it. Having had a bit of time in London before our departure, Mina and I visited the British Museum to search amongst the books and maps for information regarding Transylvania. I am sure most women would find that sort of research tedious, but Mina has always been bright and wished to make herself useful for the trip. I found it prudent to have some foreknowledge of the country before engaging in dealings with its noblemen. Quote, I find the district he named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. End quote. Footnote 4, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 16. The importance of Eastern Europe at the time of the novel's penning is notable, as there was a great deal of fear in Western Europe that the continent was going to be overrun by the customs and populations of the Eastern countries. The xenophobic tendencies of the Victorians are present throughout the entire novel. We were unable to light on any document describing the exact location of the Castle Cullen, but we found the post town named by our client, Bistritz, is fairly well known. We stayed the night at the hotel before eating a hurried breakfast so as to make the train a little before 8. We need not have hurried ourselves, though, as we sat in the carriage for a whole hour before we began to move. I remarked to Mina that it seemed the further east you travel, the less punctual the trains. Footnote 5, yet another xenophobic remark made by Harker privately in his journal, but I decided to have this remark be to Mina as she too possesses some questionable beliefs about foreigners. It was a beautiful, untamed country, and the journey was passed quite comfortably as we arrived at Bistritz on, quote, the dark side of twilight, end quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 20. Our client had directed us to the Golden Crone Hotel, a wonderfully old-fashioned establishment. When we knocked on the door, a cheery-looking elderly woman bowed and asked, Herr Englishman and Frau Englishwoman? Yes, I replied, Jonathan and Mina Harker. She smiled and spoke to an elderly man who retrieved a letter. Mr. and Mrs. Harker, thank you for coming to meet me. I wait with anticipation. At 3 tomorrow, the transport will start for Bukovina, and I have asked them to reserve 2 seats for the both of you. At the Borgo Pass, my own carriage will pick you up and bring you to the castle. I hope your trip has been good so far. Your host, Edward Cullen. Footnote 7. Dracula did not sign off his letters with his title, and I do not feel Edward would either. Fourth of May. The following morning began strangely, as the landlord and his wife began acting odd whenever I mentioned my client. I asked them about the letter and its contents to verify travel details, yet the landlord suddenly pretended he could not understand my German. I knew this to be an act, as I was perfectly understandable the previous day, so I was confused as to why my host was refusing to acknowledge my queries. The man mumbled something about the money being sent with the letter, but beyond that he gave no more insight. I took a more direct approach and asked them if they knew Count Cullen or could tell me anything about his castle, but, quote, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. End quote, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 23. Mina and I were so near the time to leave that we had no opportunities to question the other villagers, but it was not a comforting departure due to the mystery. As we were leaving, an old lady came up to our room and cried, quote, "Must you go? Oh, young hare, must you go?" End quote, Stoker, the New Annotated Dracula, page 23. She was so excited that she seemed to have lost her grip on language, as her German became intertwined with a tongue I did not know. "Do you not know what day it is?" she questioned. I glanced at Mina, then replied that it was the 4th of May. "Indeed! Quote, it is the eve of St. George's Day." Footnote 10. It is common folkloric belief that vampires are the most active on the eves of St. George's Day and St. Andrew's Day. "Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the vile things in the world will have full sway? Do you not know what you are going to?" End quote. Stoker, the New Annotated Dracula, page 24. I attempted to comfort her and relieve her of her fears, but to no avail. She eventually sank to her knees, begging me to postpone my journey for at least a day. I tried gently to explain the necessity of the trip without divulging any confidential information about the Count or his business, but this evidently did not appease her. Footnote 12. Harker is employed as an estate agent and therefore obligated to keep his client's information secret. Later in the novel, Lord Godalming uses his position to convince Dracula's other agents to divulge information about his properties, which is an interesting commentary about the trustworthiness of the rich and powerful in this time and place. With great effort, upon seeing my immovability on the subject, she dried her eyes, rose, and withdrew from her bodice a crucifix affixed on a chain. Footnote 13. Crucifixes and other holy materials ward off Stoker's vampires. She removed it from her neck and offered it to me. I was in a state of confusion, quote, for, as an English churchman, I have been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well and in such a state of mind. End quote. Stoker, the New Annotated Dracula, page 14. I suppose she must have seen the doubt on my face, for she hung the rosary around my neck and said, "For the Frau's sake." Footnote 15. In the original novel, the woman says, "For your mother's sake." I was compelled to change this to refer to Mina, as she would be more intimately affected by the loss of Jonathan as his wife if Dracula were to kill him. Furthermore, since Dracula's role is being inhabited by Edward in this version, and Edward shows a proclivity to violence towards other men he feels are threatening the woman he loves, this warning could remain applicable even with the role shift. I realized she meant Mina and turned to check on her in the corner. She seemed perplexed, having not understood the German that passed between us. I considered enlightening her after the woman departed, but I feared such insight would prove too frightful. Furthermore, the villagers' fears were likely no more than an over-imaginative folk tale, and I did not wish to worry Mina unnecessarily. Therefore, I resolved to keep the woman's warning to myself. Footnote 16. The vampire hunters keep information from Mina even when she is obviously the most vulnerable to Dracula's attacks, and therefore should be given top priority to information. This is just another questionable treatment of women. Mina could see I would divulge no secrets and wished to have time for quiet contemplation about all that had occurred, though I am not convinced that danger lay ahead of me. Quote, "Whether it is the old lady's fear, nor the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual." End quote. Stoker, the New Annotated Dracula, page 24. I've occupied myself by writing this entry for the past half hour whilst we await the coach. Ah, here it is. 5th of May, the castle. It is the early hours of the morning, and though I have not yet slept, I feel no ill effects of tiredness. Mina sleeps restlessly in the bed, whilst I write this at the writing desk. I feel I must place down the strange occurrences that have transpired thus far until sleep comes to claim me, though what I have to tell may seem fantastic, and lest one believe I began my journey to the castle after dining too well, I shall call upon the shared testimony of my wife, whom I know wrote down her own account of events before going to bed last night. Footnote 18. Harker's being polite here. He means lest anybody suspect he was drunk last night and made the whole story up. When we got on the coach, the driver had not yet taken his seat, but was instead talking with the landlady. It was clear from the quick glances they stole of Mina and I that we were the topic of discussion. Some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door stood and listened to their conversation and would also look at us, many of them in a pitying way. Though not usually prone to listening to conversations of which I am not a part, I could not but help overhearing repeated words in a variety of dialects, as many nationalities had joined the crowd. I withdrew my polyglot dictionary from my bag and looked them out. Quote, I must say, they were not cheering to me, for among them were Ordog, Satan, Bokol, Hell, Sregoika, Witch, Vrolok, and Vokoshlak, both of which mean the same thing, one being Slovak and the other Servian, for something that is either werewolf or vampire. End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 26. When we started, those standing round the inn door, of which there were now enough to create a large crowd, made strange gestures towards Mina and I. I inquired about the gestures to a fellow passenger. He did not wish to speak at first, but after some coaxing, quote, he explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye, end quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 26. Footnote 20. The villagers in the novel are described as making the sign of the cross and pointing two fingers at Harker, but in The Essential Dracula by Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu, Romanian folklore has few hand signs to ward off evil except the three-fingered sign of the cross. Perhaps this discrepancy means the original Harker wrote down his account after the fact. Mina looked at me curiously, a slight sheen of tears in her eyes upon seeing the villagers' sympathy and sorrow, and indeed, who could not be touched by such displays of emotion? My love, Mina asked quietly, have you any idea why they seem so sorry to see us go? I shook my head, unable to offer any more explanation. As I observed the villagers and their continued gestures, I became almost positive that their words were directed increasingly towards Mina rather than myself, though it was difficult to be sure, and even if I had no doubt as to the object of the villagers' superstition, it seemed to me unwise to worry Mina any more than she must already be suffering. I could not help but be startled, though, when our landlady rushed out of the inn, carrying a ring of some sort of vegetable. She approached the coach quickly and draped a necklace of flowers over Mina's head. Footnote 21. I decided to expedite the process of folkloric practices used to ward off or kill vampires in this condensed version as much as possible. These deterrents occur throughout the original novel. Once the scent hit my nose, I was shocked to find that the bulbs were wild garlic plants. Mina gazed at her wonderingly as the woman spoke in heavily accented English. Keep this with you at all times, my dear. It will keep you safe. Mina obviously did not understand the woman's meaning any more than I did, but the earnestness in her face and the urgency with which she spoke induced her to accept the gift graciously. Then, a curious thing happened. This first gift seemed to compel others to bestow various presents upon Mina. One gave a communion wafer. Footnote 22. The host, as it is called in the novel, is used by the vampire hunters to purify Dracula's resting places. Actually, later in the novel, as Mina is in the process of turning into a vampire, Van Helsing touches her forehead with the wafer and she is burned. Another provided Mina with a crucifix. One even handed me a large wooden stake. Footnote 23. Van Helsing explains that the wooden stake does not kill the vampire necessarily, but it keeps it in place long enough to cut off its head and fill its mouth with garlic, which will make sure the vampire does not rise again. We placed our offerings between our feet, and Mina thanked the villagers for their generosity and hospitality before we were away. It was not a pleasant way to begin the journey, but our anxieties were soon assuaged by the beautiful landscape surrounding our coach. Furthermore, as I was incapable of discerning the languages of our fellow passengers and their muted remarks that doubtlessly pertained to Mina and I, we were able to cast off our fears entirely. Quote, before us lay a green sloping land full of forests and woods, with here and there steep hills, crowned with clumps of trees, or with farmhouses, the blank gable end to the road. End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 28. The road was rugged, but our driver pushed the horses ever faster, as if attempting to outrun some invisible threat. The sun began to set behind the mountains, and the growing darkness seemed to turn trees, earth, and sky into one amalgamous shape. The atmosphere grew solemn and grim, no doubt the result of the day's previous events. When it reached full darkness, the other passengers seemed to grow excited, urging the coachman to further speed. He pushed the horses faster, he whipped them unmercifully, and he shouted encouragement at them to more exertions. The road at one point grew so uneven, and the speed at which we were traveling was so great, I was forced to hold Mina into her seat with one arm and myself with the other. The road eventually grew level again, and we flew along. Finally, the unyielding black mountainside gave way to a patch of gray, the Borgo Pass. Upon this sight, the fellow passengers began speaking blessings, kind words, and engaging in the same gesture we saw outside of the inn. However, not one of them would explain the motive behind their actions. We stopped, the passengers grew quiet, and I waited with anticipation to see the Count's carriage approach to deliver us to our destination and our host. When no such carriage appeared, I fell back against my seat in disappointment, whilst our companions seemed to mock my dismay with glad smiles of their own. I was just contemplating what I ought to do when the driver turned around to look at us. He consulted his watch, then explained. Quote, "There is no carriage here." End quote, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 34. "The Herr and the Frau must not be expected after all. They will travel onward and return tomorrow. Or the next day. Better the next day." The last syllable had fallen from his lips when our fellow passengers began screaming and crossing themselves upon the arrival of a caleche with 4 horses. I clutched Mina to me upon hearing the passengers' shrieks, but after seeing the driver of the carriage, I wondered if perhaps our companions had gone mad. The driver was but a young man with a willowy but strong frame. His copper-toned hair was unkempt, but did not give the impression of messiness or sloth. His skin was so pale that it seemed like a beacon in the black of night, drawing all eyes around him towards his figure. It was difficult to tell in the darkness, but his eyes appeared to be the shade of coal. Overall, he had a pleasing appearance, but his countenance was brooding and his manners surly. I could understand a sense of discomfort around his unwelcoming air, but the screams of our fellow passengers seemed a vast overreaction. He turned to the driver and said, "You are early," he stated in an American accent to my surprise. Footnote 26. Professor Matthew Pateman talks about the importance and the difference between the Eastern European vampire, Dracula, and the American vampire, Edward, or in Pateman's research, Buffy the Vampire Slayer characters, Angel and Spike. The man stammered in reply, "The English Herr and Frau were in a hurry." The young man rolled his eyes and turned to look at us. His gaze rested on me for only a moment before flickering to Mina. I could not discern what he was feeling, but his eyes did not find mine again. Instead, they remained fixed on my wife. Glancing at her, I could see she was transfixed as well, unable to move and unsure what to do under the scrutiny of the driver. I placed a protective arm around Mina's shoulder, breaking her from her trance. The wind suddenly blew, ruffling Mina's hair. What occurred next I could not explain, as the driver, who up to this point had seemed relaxed to the point of boredom, grew stiff as a board. Footnote 27. Meyer's vampires can smell human blood, and some blood, like Bella's in Twilight, is extremely enticing. Mina's blood is not said to be any more or less appealing in Dracula, but I added this trait to more accurately depict Edward's reactions and feelings towards drinking a human's blood. I do not believe he even breathed. Footnote 28. Meyer's vampires do not need to breathe, but they do so to appear human. His muscles clenched as if in restraint, and his mouth hardened into a fine line. "Give me their bags," the driver demanded. Our luggage was handed over with alarming speed as I helped Mina out of the carriage. The driver stood to the side as Mina ascended the caleche, his eyes following her with unnerving intensity. As I stepped up into the transport, the driver held out a hand and caught my arm with a grip of steel. End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 36. Footnote 29. Both Dracula and Edward share superhuman strength. He said nothing, merely mounted the coach and flicked the reins. As the horses faded into the darkness, I felt a strange chill of foreboding. Mina must have felt it too, as her hand found mine in the inky black of night. We rode in silence for quite some time. The driver remained tense, his long fingers clutching the reins and turning them about in his hands like a handkerchief. I motioned to Mina to let my hand go, struck a match, and checked my watch. With a shock, I found it was merely a few minutes until midnight. Though not particularly superstitious, the events of the day had planted a seed of fear in my heart and a feeling of suspense in my mind. Quote, "Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains, on each side of us, began a loud and sharp howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way." End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 37. Footnote 30, wolves react to both Edward and Dracula. The driver straightened at the noise, then flicked the reins again, urging the horses to go faster. Soon trees surrounded us and in some places arched above the roadway, producing an effect not dissimilar to a tunnel. A fine, powdery snow began to fall, and the howls of the wolves grew ever closer. The nearer the howls, the faster the driver pushed the horses. At one point, it seemed as though the wolves were right behind us, and snapping at our carriage wheels, the symphony of their howls seemed so near. Mina clung to my arm, mumbling a prayer of protection. I bowed my head near hers and listened to her prayer. I was vaguely aware by the movement of the carriage that we must be ascending the road, and I whispered to Mina, "The wolves will not follow us up the mountain. They will stay in the trees, where they are not exposed." Mina merely nodded and ceased her petitions. I raised my head to look around us and saw with a start that we had come upon our destination. Quote, "The driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky." End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 39. Footnote 31, this is also where Chapter 1 ends. We slowed in a courtyard of considerable size with equally considerable gloom. Our young driver jumped down, quote, and held out his hand to assist me to alight. Again, I could not help but notice his prodigious strength. End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 40. After releasing me, he attended to our bags expeditiously, leaving me to aid Mina in her descent. She had just stepped out, and the driver was already back on his seat, flicking the reins. The horses and coach disappeared down one of the dark openings. The driver gave us no instruction about whether to knock or simply await a servant to fetch us. I looked about and found there was no knocker or bell, and a quick examination of the thick walls and dark windows convinced me that no voice would penetrate it. I felt my fears assail me at full force now. What sort of journey had I embarked on? What sort of place and what sort of people was I now to be subjected to? Quote, "Was this a customary incident in the life of a solicitor's clerk, sent out to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner?" End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 42. Footnote 33, this is actually Harker's first job as a full-blown solicitor, as he just received news of the results of his examination before leaving London. In Dracula, the Count wishes to move to London, presumably for better hunting grounds. And worst of all, I had coerced Mina into joining me for it. Mina herself seemed to be feeling the anxiety the place was causing and found my hand. She murmured to me, "There, there, my darling. We shall be all right as long as we stay by each other's side. Now, what do you suppose we should do?" "I haven't the faintest idea," I responded. "This is most unusual." She nodded, then smiled in an encouraging way. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could respond, the deafening sound of rattling chains and massive bolts being drawn pierced the air. A key was turned and created a grating noise of long disuse, and the door swung open. Within, to my shock, was the driver. Footnote 34. In Dracula, the Count uses a disguise when transporting Harker to the castle to hide the fact that there are no servants. However, in Twilight, Edward does not think to wear colored contacts to hide the fact that his eyes change color, nor does he wear makeup of any way to hide the fact that he is deathly pale. Therefore, I find it unlikely that Edward would think to wear a disguise. While driving the coach, he wore a long coat. He now was apparelled in what I can only assume to be his undershirt, as it was of a thin, white material, and waist overalls. Footnote 35. Simplified. Jeans and a white t-shirt. Nothing about Edward is changing, not even his wardrobe. He is a modern American vampire in a historic Eastern European setting. The sleeves were pushed to his elbows, and I wondered how he was not freezing in the snow and cold. Footnote 36. Myers vampires don't have blood, therefore they do not produce body heat. However, they also do not need body heat as they are technically dead. Dracula's skin is also said to be ice cold. I heard Mina next to me inhale a sharp intake of breath at our welcomer's indecency. The man looked at me, his eyes hard. When they turned to Mina, they grew even more intense, and he did not look away while he said, "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Harker, to my home." I stepped forward impulsively, wanting to get out of the snow more than anything. He stood to the side while we passed him, and I noticed he became rigid again as Mina walked in front of him. Footnote 37. One could ask why, if Edward does not need to breathe, he doesn't just stop breathing while Mina is around to avoid inhaling her scent. Edward does not think to do this in Twilight with Bella, so he cannot think to do this in Dracula with Mina. After crossing the threshold, I shook his hand. The same vice-like grip surrounded my own, and I found I could not proceed before clarifying. "Count Cullen?" He nodded once and replied, "I am Edward Cullen. Come with me, I'm sure you're both tired and hungry." Before I could stop him, our host had saddled himself with our luggage and was stalking towards a passage. I went to protest, but he interrupted. "No, you're my guest. I'll see to your rooms myself." I opened my mouth to explain that surely a servant could attend to such matters, but before I could uttered a syllable, he seemed to preemptively respond. Footnote 38. Edward can read minds. "I have no servants. I prefer to do things myself." Mina and I shared an astonished look. No servants? In a castle this size and with a title such as Count? I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had dismissed them prematurely in preparation for his move to London. He was quite young, after all. It would not be entirely surprising if he had little knowledge of how to handle these types of transitions. I satisfied myself with that conclusion. Count Cullen had only just become a man by the looks of it, and he had simply erred in his timing. Footnote 31. Though Edward stopped aging at 17, his otherworldly beauty is described to make him appear older, and he's actually 104 in the first Twilight book. This could also explain his indecorous presentation and manner. While this would likely cause some discomfort for Mina and I during our stay, it was nothing we could not abide. Count Cullen led us up a winding stair, then along another passage. Quote, "At the end of this, he threw open a heavy door, and I rejoiced to see within a well-lit room in which a table was spread for supper, and on whose mighty hearth a great fire of logs flamed and flared." End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 43. The Count closed the door before leading us to another room. We did not tarry there, but instead passed into a great, well-lit bedroom warmed by another fire in the hearth. Count Cullen placed our bags inside and withdrew, saying before he closed the door, "I'll meet you in the dining room after you've both freshened up." He cast one last glance at both of us, then shut the door. Mina turned to me immediately and inquired, "Dearest, I must confess I am at a loss about what to make of all of this. Have you any ideas about our host and his living situation? You know I shall trust your judgment on such matters, but as of now I feel it prudent to conclude your business as quickly as possible and then leave this desolate place." I explained to her my theory, gradually calming her fears about our safety. As I mentioned Count Cullen's young age and probable inexperience with business, I could see she was won over by my logic. She replied, "Very well. I shall trust your hypothesis and endeavor to be as civil as possible. Perhaps decorum on our side shall withdraw manners from his." We refreshed ourselves after the journey, then made our way into the other room. Our host stood by the fireplace, gestured to the table, and commanded, "Eat. Excuse me for not joining you." I, in my hunger, had already forgotten Mina's earlier scheme to behave with the utmost politeness. To her credit, she did not. She objected, "Oh, dear Count Cullen, we could not possibly begin without our gracious host. Please, I implore you." She extended a graceful hand to the chair at the head of the table. Count Cullen peered at her with searching eyes, though this time Mina did not falter under their gaze. Footnote 41. Mina is actually quite level-headed and clever in Dracula. Furthermore, unlike Bella, a 17-year-old who blushes under Edward's attention and fumbles for words, Mina is a married, educated young woman who is past the stage for blushing and bumbling for the most part. I detected an emotion nearing disappointment or dissatisfaction in the Count's face, as though some goal had been unmet. Footnote 42. Mina is acting for Bella in this scenario, and Edward cannot read Bella's mind. That is partially what drew Edward to her in the first place, therefore this will draw Edward to Mina now. He replied in the most gracious tone we had heard from him thus far. "Thank you, Mrs. Harker, I will, though I'm not very hungry." He sat at the aforementioned chair and speared a roasted chicken breast. Mina and I followed suit. Whilst I ate greedily, Count Cullen took only the smallest of bites off his plate. Footnote 43, Myers vampires can eat human food, unlike Dracula, but they don't require it. We ate in relative silence, broken only by the occasional polite inquiry by Mina and curt response from our host. As we finished, I could see a slight streak of dawn on the horizon through the window. Quote, "There seemed to be a strange stillness over everything, but as I listened, I heard as if from down below in the valley the howling of many wolves." End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 47. Mina jumped slightly and laid her utensils down before commenting in a gentle yet nervous tone, "My, Count Cullen, there seem to be a large population of wolves in this part of the country." The Count looked out the window, anger suddenly flaring to his face. Footnote 45, while Dracula has the ability to control wolves, Myers vampires and wolves are sworn enemies. He replied, "Yes, there are. That's part of the reason why I want to move to London." Mina responded in a sympathetic tone, "It must be difficult to sleep at night, with the noise they create." Count Cullen smiled then for the first time, revealing a set of white, straight teeth. Footnote 46, Myers vampires are not described as having particularly sharp canine teeth. The smile was not happy, though, resembling a sneer. He answered, "You have no idea." He stared at Mina then, his eyes unwavering. She stared back for a moment, though I could see discomfort growing on her features. Her gaze flickered to mine, and I interjected, "Count Cullen, thank you for this excellent meal, and for the pleasure of your company. We do not wish to be rude, but we have been traveling for the better part of the night. Would you excuse us for the night?" Our host turned to me, his expression cold, though when he spoke, forced civility dripped from each word. "Of course, how rude of me. Good night to the both of you." We rose, Mina and I making our way to the bedroom. She turned one last time to remark, "Thank you, Count Cullen, for your most warm welcome and delicious meal." Count Cullen replied, "Call me Edward." Footnote 47. Edward's curt, rude mood reflects how recently he has fed. We will see the positive effects of feeding later. The door closed, yet despite the barrier between us and the Count, I still felt as though his presence permeated the atmosphere. Mina shuddered at the invitation to friendship, and we made our way to bed in confused, fearful silence. I attempted to sleep, but all through the night there were shrieks of animals sounding as though they were being attacked, echoing through the forest, reinforcing our own feelings of entrapment. Footnote 48. This is Edward feeding on animals. He does not feed on humans, though he mentions multiple times a desire to drink Bella's, or in this case Mina's, blood. He jokes he's a vegetarian vampire. Mina Harker's journal. Footnote 49. Mina's journal is not featured until the 5th chapter of the book, but I decided to put her perspective here as Edward's full character is best revealed through his interactions with women. The rest of the story is penned entirely by me. 6th of May. Today has been more perplexing and horrible than yesterday. Even as I write, I am at war with myself. A portion of me wants nothing more than to pour my soul out to Jonathan, to tell him of all the misdeeds I have thought and done today, all the terrible sins I have committed. Footnote 50. We're going to see this as a bit overdramatic, but it is important to remember that Mina is a married Victorian-era woman. The other part wants to write these acts down, to confess to God and myself what I have done, then burn this book and never allow Jonathan to read it. I suppose by the end of this entry, I shall make my choice. The sun was nearing midday when I awoke, having slept late after last night's intrigues. Thinking about it makes my very soul quiver. I did my best to keep my countenance steady and my feelings hidden, but the terror I felt last night was palpable in nature. Footnote 15. Mina's reaction is similar to her reaction in the original text when she is fed upon. Similarly, Bella reacts this way to Edward after he acts towards her in a similar way he has towards Mina thus far. Count Cullen's continual glances in my direction, the way he held my gaze without flinching, it was an overwhelming sensation. I suspect Jonathan was little aware of this, being too occupied with business or easing my fears to notice any particular attention towards me from the Count. But when he invited me to call him by his Christian name, I could not but help feel a shudder pass through my bones. The request for intimacy, right in front of my husband! This was too forward for me to bear with perfect fortitude. However, the sun's gentle rays and a good night's sleep helped rid the clouds of confusion in my mind, and I determined to pass the day in quiet solitude as Jonathan and Count Cullen discussed their business. I wished Jonathan luck as he left to meet the Count, and said a silent prayer in my heart that they would conclude quickly so we may leave this place and its owner behind. I dressed and decided to take a stroll outside. The sun had melted the snow of last night, and there was only a brisk breeze in the air rather than a harsh gale. The fresh air cleared my head of the last strands of worry. What evil could there be in the world more powerful than the goodness of nature? I had just decided to return indoors as clouds began to obscure the sun, when a voice behind me asked, "May I join you?" I turned to see Count Cullen leaning against the stone wall of the palace, his arms crossed in front of him. Footnote 52. Both Stoker's and Meyer's vampires can go out in the sun without physical pain being caused to them. Our conception that vampires cannot enter the sun follows the lines of Nosferatu. However, we will see soon that direct sunlight does produce supernatural effects for Edward. He looked healthier than he did last night, whereas before he had a sickly pallor and dark eyes with purple circles of many sleepless nights underneath them. Today his pale skin had a tinge of color in the cheeks, and the circles had improved. His tense muscles from last night were relaxed, though still scandalously visible, for, despite the chill, he wore only a tan sweater with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and the trousers that I knew Americans seemed to favor. The most striking difference was his eyes, which had peered so endlessly at me last night, giving me plenty of time to inspect them and determine their hue. I was certain that last night his eyes had been coal-colored, yet today they resembled a bright topaz. Footnote 53. These are the positive effects of feeding that were mentioned earlier. Meyer's vampires appear more human, with their eyes changing to a lighter color after they feed. His easy stance and open countenance was so different from last night that it took me a moment to respond. Of course, Count Cullen, though I fear for your health in your current attire." He merely smiled, though was not filled with the menace and cynicism that had caused such alarm last night. This smile seemed genuinely amused by my remark. He moved from his place on the wall and came to stand beside me before replying. "First, it's just Edward. And second, thank you for your concern, but no, I'm fine. I've grown used to the cold." We began walking the length of the castle, stone walls rising to our right, while on our left was a small patch of land before dropping into nothingness. Footnote 54. Dracula's castle rests atop a cliff. I said nothing, feeling awkward in this stranger's company and without my husband to ease my nerves. I trained my eyes forward, though I could feel Count Cullen's gaze upon my face. He asked, "Why did you come with your husband on this business trip?" I answered, "This journey has a dual purpose. Since Jonathan has just recently earned his title of solicitor, we both felt it would be unwise for him to take time away from work for our honeymoon. We agreed I would accompany him and allow this trip to act as our honeymoon." Count Cullen's face betrayed his surprise. He inquired with a confused tone, "You gave up a traditional honeymoon just so your husband could continue his work?" Footnote 55. Anytime Bella does anything remotely selfless in Twilight, Edward is very confused. Mina's sacrifice of her honeymoon would therefore be very perplexing to him. His confusion towards compassion tells the reader quite a bit about his own capacity for it as well. I nodded and stated firmly, "Of course. I love Jonathan, and I would gladly give up much more than a simple honeymoon to be with him." I grew slightly embarrassed by this declaration, and I could feel my face tinge pink. I hoped the Count would ignore my outburst, but he continued to stare at me. The wind blew, ruffling my hair into my face. Then Count Cullen did something I still cannot explain. He reached out a hand and placed one lock of my hair behind my ear. When his fingers grazed my skin, I was shocked by how cold they were. I froze where I stood and looked at him sharply. His eyes never faltered from my face, and I grew uncomfortable under his gaze. He murmured, quote, "The blush on your cheeks is lovely," end quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 275. My mind was in a state of confusion. I wanted to leave, to run to Jonathan and tell him we could not stay here another moment. However, my muscles refused to react to my demands, and I stood entirely still, as though a single twitch would cause some horrible disaster. And, worst of all, I found my heart racing and a horrible swell of excitement rise to my chest. Oh, to harbor feelings of attraction for another man whilst on my honeymoon with my husband just inside. These are the actions of a deplorable wretch in a novel, not a respectable married woman. I forced my mind to recollect all the love and affection I had for Jonathan, and rallied behind it to declare, "Count Cullen, I must return inside." He smiled crookedly, his eyes traveling from my face to my neck. His hand traced the curve of my ear and rested on my throat. His touch was so soft it could have been a feather blown in the wind to alight on my skin. That wicked sensation of excitement arose to a crescendo, and I stepped back as though shocked by lightning. This surprised the Count as well, and his smile fell. A dangerous look lit his eyes, and he stated, "I shall let you return inside on one condition. Call me Edward." My excited state evaporated. His threat seemed sincere, though it was suddenly difficult to take him seriously, as his warning and his appearance could not be reconciled. His threat belonged to a man of great authority and importance who could make demands and expect them to be followed through. His appearance was that of a surly young man, likely at least 3 years my junior, who simply wanted to be taken seriously by other adults. Footnote 57. This is another key difference between Edward and Dracula. Dracula is actually capable of violence without remorse and authoritative, while Edward grapples with the moral quandary of his actions nearly every scene and is viewed as a loner, moody teenager by basically everyone except Bella. Nevertheless, I felt it prudent to play along rather than incite an argument. Therefore, though I loathed to give in to his demands, I responded, "I must return inside, Edward." He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply as though my words had relieved him of some great pain. I turned and walked towards the great door, not wishing to stay any longer in the presence of this man who incited such undeserving, sinful feelings in me. I had taken only a few steps when the Count called, "Mina!" I paused and looked at him over my shoulder, refusing to turn all the way around. He held out entreating hands and began, "Please understand. It would probably be better if we weren't friends. I'm not good. I wouldn't be good to you." Footnote 58. Edward says a similar thing to Bella, though when Bella hears it, she feels remorseful. Mina is just relieved. I nodded, attempting to disguise my relief. It would be much easier to withstand our stay at the castle if Count Cullen and I engaged in mutual avoidance. I assented. I believe that would be for the best. With no final words of parting, I retreated back inside the castle, attempting to reconcile the emotional turmoil I had just endured. It seemed to me as though Count Cullen possessed two people inside of him. I thought back to the gifts the villagers had bestowed upon us and their ghastness that we were traveling to meet Count Cullen. However, their terror hardly seemed proportional to what had just stood before me, attempting to intimidate me. The villagers had prepared me to see a terrifying monster of evil and wickedness. Instead, all I saw was a young man who thought he was one. Footnote 59. This is the major difference. Vampires occupy a liminal taboo space. They are not dead, but they are not alive. This position allows them a unique advantage to talk about things outside of what is, quote-unquote, appropriate. Dracula and Edward's capacity to drink blood is both entrenched in sexual illusions, but the response to them is different. Dracula's blood-sucking is monstrous and polluting, so sex here is monstrous and polluting. Dracula is a monster. Edward's blood-sucking is enticing and seductive, so sex here is enticing and seductive. Edward is not supposed to be a monster, though he thinks he is. I retreated to my room to collect my thoughts, and that is where I now find myself. I thought by recording the day's events thus far I could determine how to proceed, but all I have concocted is half schemes and partial formulations. Of one thing, though, I am absolutely decided. I must tell Jonathan about my moment of weakness. Footnote 60. Mina and Jonathan promised to be honest with one another in the original text, though Mina is the only one to keep this promise. In this version, she will not be totally honest. I would feel constantly guilty every time I looked at him if I did not divulge this terrible secret. I can only hope he will forgive me. If I may be allowed to hope, perhaps this will expedite our trip judiciously. O God, forgive me of my trespasses and grant me grace, though I know I have done little to deserve it. Here comes Jonathan. 6th of May continued. Thanks be to God for bestowing upon me the most understanding and forgiving of men. When Jonathan returned to the room, I revealed the entire shameful truth through plentiful tears and hearty apologies. When I had finished, I hid my face with my hands, too terrified to see the betrayal I was sure to find on Jonathan's face. Instead, he pulled my hands away and kissed them, assuring softly, "My dear, dear Mina, you need not worry, I hold nothing against you. The Count obviously possesses a very beguiling nature, and amongst all the anxieties and perplexities of this trip, it is no wonder that your mind should grow confused. Based on what you told me, I am certain that your heart never wavered. Nay, I know it to be so, for you have goodness and courage enough to confess to me these deeds without knowing my reaction. Oh, Mina, this is not just your sin but mine for depriving you of a true honeymoon and nearly forcing you to accompany me on a trip that was bound to be of little interest to you. No, my dear, the fault lies on me as well for neglecting you." Footnote 61. When the vampire hunters catch Dracula in the act of feeding on Mina, Mina recounts that she found she did not want to stop Dracula from drinking her blood. Whether this was by Dracula's hypnotism or her own volition, she was a quote-unquote willing participant. When she viewed herself as unclean for such an act, Jonathan forgave her. I feel the same principle would apply here, as Jonathan is not forgiving her for acting, he is forgiving her inclination to act. I fell into his arms, my hot tears of shame transforming into warm tears of love and grace. Such felicity after my betrayal. I am undeserving of this joy. My happiness was marred slightly when Jonathan told me of his suspicion about Count Cullen's prodigious strength, a talent that, if true, reignited some fear about my safety around the Count. However, I am sure that Jonathan was merely feeling Count Cullen's grip to an inordinate degree because of the fear we both were feeling at the time. A mere gust of wind would have been enough to frighten us, how much more so would a strong grip on the arm? I dreaded going to supper, yet felt compelled not only by my own hunger, but by the desire to keep my husband company. I knew he too must be feeling the awkwardness of such a meeting after the day's events, and I could not allow myself to permit him to face the Count on his own. I decided I would go to supper and would ignore Count Cullen as much as possible. However, upon following through with what I had assumed to be the mutual agreement to avoid each other, Count Cullen seemed to find every opportunity to throw himself into my path. He pulled out my chair, sat leaning towards me, retrieved my spoon when it fell on the floor. I pointedly looked away from him the whole supper, though I could feel his eyes never leave me. When supper was over, he asked, "Mina, may I speak with you alone?" Jonathan looked at me concerned, asking the silent question. Should he refuse such a request on my behalf or allow me to speak with Count Cullen privately? I gave a slight smile and nodded. I felt no fear of losing control of my emotions anymore. I had overcome such weakness and now could face Count Cullen with no danger. Jonathan rose and said, "I shall retire then." He withdrew into the bedroom, and though my eyes followed him, the Count's did not. When the door was shut, Count Cullen pulled his chair close to mine and remarked, "Your husband doesn't want to leave you alone." I finally set my gaze upon his, seeing that mischievous, arrogant glint in his eyes as earlier. I inquired, "How could you possibly know that to be true?" One corner of his mouth rose to a pompous half-grin, and he circumvented the question with his own. "You're very curious, aren't you?" I grew puzzled and replied, "It was just one question, though you do not seem inclined to answer it." He leaned back against his chair and shrugged before promising, "A story for another day." I looked away, unsure what to do. After the silence stretched to an uncomfortably long duration, I asked, "Was there something you wished to ask me?" He smirked yet again and answered. Footnote 62. I do not think I can stress enough how many times Edward Cullen is described as smirking. It is substantial. "Yes, are you really so intent on ignoring me that you won't even look at me?" I once again grew confused and responded, "I fear we may have misunderstood each other, Count Cullen. I was under the impression we'd both agreed to avoid each other. You suggested the idea just a few hours earlier." His face grew dark and he corrected. Again, it's Edward, and, quote, I said it would be better if we weren't friends, not that I didn't want to be. End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 84. My head was reeling, trying to follow his logic. I shook my head and replied, I'm not sure I follow you. He drew close to me and enunciated each word as though I was a simpleton. Quote, if you're smart, you'll avoid me. End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 88. I searched his face for clarification. He suggested twice now that I should keep out of his path, yet he also seemed to be intentionally throwing himself into mine. Footnote 65. This is how Edward acts in Twilight as well, only Bella gets excited when he pays attention to her and angry at him for flipping back and forth between avoiding her and pursuing her. Mina is just confused and annoyed. Where was the logic here? What could I be missing? I rose and stated with as much authority as I could muster. Count Cullen, I was perfectly sincere earlier when I agreed that the best course of action would be for the two of us to avoid each other as much as possible. I shall make every endeavor to do so for the remainder of my time here, and I pray you follow suit regardless of what you think you may feel. I walked towards the door, ready to fall into bed and contemplate the Count's conflicting behavior. My hand was on the door when he murmured back, That's just it. I don't know how I feel. I glanced back at him. He appeared so distraught that I almost felt pity for him. Footnote 66. Mina feels pity for Dracula after he feeds on her, so it's not a stretch that she would feel pity for Edward after he throws himself at her only to be rejected. I replied, Then I pray you come to understand your emotions, but do know that whatever you may feel for me, I am in love with my husband. While I am sorry to cause pain, it will not change that fact. With those words, I left Count Cullen seated at the supper table, alone. The following story is fantastical in nature, and I am sure will be regarded widely as a fiction or falsehood. All I can offer is an assurance to its truth upon my word as a respectable woman and as an honest Christian. The knowledge I now possess will doubtlessly haunt my mind and dreams for some time, yet I feel better for knowing it than living in mystery. I shall explain my experience forthwith in regards to Count Edward Cullen. The day began poorly, as last night I could have sworn to have seen Count Cullen in my room. Footnote 67. Edward does in fact break into Bella's house and watch her sleep, therefore he will practice the same habit here. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and when I opened them, he was gone. I suppose it was simply a vivid dream, but it still left me shaken. Jonathan left to do business with Count Cullen early in the morning. We agreed that he would attempt to expedite the process as much as possible, and we would, God willing, be ready to leave by tomorrow. I considered myself safe from running into Count Cullen while he was meeting with my husband. I hoped my words to him last night would leave him with no doubts as to where my loyalties and affections lie, yet some small part of me still suspected that he had not understood. It was nearing a dark, cloudy noon when I saw Count Cullen for the first time. It was a confusing encounter, as I was making my way to the library, and I could have sworn I heard him in the dining room with Jonathan when I passed. However, as I opened the doors to the library, the Count was sitting in an armchair, reading. Footnote 68. Edward has super speed. I was surprised, needless to say, and even thought about leaving, but Count Cullen looked up at me pleasantly and beckoned me in with a finger. I entered hesitantly, explaining, I am merely looking for a book to bring back to my room with me. The Count's smirk fell slightly. He rose from his chair and stalked to a bookcase, pulling a volume off the shelf. He thrust it into my hands and replied, This is one of my favorites. I nodded, looking at the cover instead of his face. I answered quietly, Thank you, Count Cullen. His ice-cold fingers found my chin and lifted it. Despite my confidence and my love for Jonathan, part of me still felt that electric shock pass through my veins when his icy hands found my face. He forced me to look into his eyes. I knew what he expected and corrected flatly. Thank you, Edward. He grinned and said, You don't like me. It was not phrased like a question. I pulled my face from his grasp and responded, I have made my intentions perfectly clear, yet you continue to pursue this course of action, though I cannot say with certainty that you do pursue me, for you have also cautioned me against your company multiple times. I do not know what to think. Count Cullen looked from me to the clouds outside. He appeared carved out of marble, too beautiful for any human. He said then, without looking at me, "Your husband is wondering where I disappeared to. He's thinking I sought you out. I suppose he's correct in that regard." I said nothing in response. He closed his eyes and tilted his head as though listening intently for some lost melody. He continued, "What are you thinking?" A suspicion that had not crossed my mind until that moment suddenly became the predominant thought in my brain. His appearance, his ice-cold skin, the fear of the villagers, and his ability to discern what Jonathan was thinking. I had heard stories of ghosts so vivid they appear real, of people who could hear the minds of others, of corpses not yet fully dead emerging from their grave forever changed. Footnote 69. Bit of Victorian history for you. After the cholera epidemic, there were several cases of people being buried prematurely, essentially being buried alive. There were stories of people leaving scratch marks in coffins as they desperately tried to escape. Therefore, Mina's knowledge of quote-unquote corpses apparently leaving the grave reanimated is not entirely based in fiction. Though my common sense, my reason, my knowledge of truth fought against it, I could not deny the fact that it was possible, nay, plausible, that Edward Cullen was not entirely human. I responded honestly, hoping to incite a similar truthful response from him. "I am attempting to determine what you are." He looked at me then, his eyes gleaming. They were a shade darker than the topaz of yesterday, though not the black coal of our first meeting. He responded quietly, yet confidently, "Would you like me to show you?" Footnote 70. Edward takes much longer to reveal his nature to Bella, however, we do not have the time for such build-up. I was terrified, but more than terror, I was titillated. I had never encountered a being so otherworldly in my entire life. I nodded my consent to his truth. I would be unable to proceed until I was positive of Count Cullen's nature. The Count approached me and, before I could protest, flung me onto his back. My arms instinctively wrapped around his neck to keep myself from falling, and Count Cullen grabbed my knees. I began to shout my objections, but he only laughed and ran towards the window faster than I could see. The library was a blur. I faintly heard the shattering of glass, and then I felt a sensation like falling, although it did not possess the stomach-clenching, chaotic feeling of falling. It was like gliding on air. Count Cullen's feet did not seem to touch the ground, and all around me were blurs of green, brown, and white. We continued that way for a while, and when we finally stopped, my head spun from the journey. Count Cullen placed my feet on the ground, yet I collapsed immediately. He laughed again and offered a hand to help me stand. Once my vision cleared, I could see we were almost at the peak of a mountain, standing beneath the shade of a tree. In the far, far distance, I could see a speck of gray and brown on a lower cliffside, and realized with a shock that it was the castle. In the few seconds that we had been traveling, we had managed to travel kilometers. I felt a nauseous sensation build in my stomach, and would have lost my breakfast if not for Count Cullen's hands cupping my face. The coolness of his palms eased the heat of my anxiety. My eyes closed, and I stood still, held there by the Count's hands and drinking up the coolness of his touch. He was not even breathing laboriously, though the small exhales that did come hit my face with an intoxicating scent. Footnote 71. Edward's breath apparently smells really nice, as it is mentioned several times in Twilight. I unconsciously found myself leaning towards him, only for both of us to push the other away. When he stepped back, his face betrayed both excitement and fear as he emerged into full sunlight for the first time. What I saw then was beyond any human comprehension. Edward's skin began to shimmer. Footnote 72. From here on out, Mina refers to him as Edward. I decided to make this change as I felt this is when she first feels that intimacy can be forged due to her knowledge about his secret. His face, arms, chest, and hands all sparkled in the sunshine, reflecting light off the surface as though covered in diamonds. My mouth fell open in wonder. It was beautiful and terrifying. No human being looked this way. No human being could run from one mountaintop to another in less than a minute. I was either in the presence of an angel or a demon. Edward gazed at me contemplatively and asked, "Are you scared?" I nodded once, unsure of my voice in the presence of this being. Footnote 73. Bella claims not to be scared in Twilight, as she does not wish to make Edward feel guilty and wants to keep him near. Mina is under no such obligation. I found I could not move from my spot, though. He seemed to recognize my awe and muttered, quote, "I'm the world's best predator, aren't I? Everything about me invites you in. My voice, my face, even my smell. As if I'd need any of that." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 263 and 264. Faster than I could follow, Edward was 50 meters away. He reappeared for a moment, only to transform into a blur and land back at my side. He shouted with a bitter tone, quote, "As if you could outrun me." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 264. He turned to a tree and ripped a large branch straight off the trunk. With effortless power, he threw the branch like a javelin 100 meters, and it splintered against a pine. The pine cones of the tree fell like rain upon the impact, peppering the ground. He turned back to me and murmured gently, quote, "As if you could fight me off." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 264. I quivered, aware now that Jonathan had not been exaggerating Edward's strength. He was awash with excitement now that the facade had been dropped to allow for a full display of his power. I tried to calm myself and managed to whisper out, "What are you?" He smiled, flashing perfect white teeth at me. His hollow answer shook my very bones and soul, and I struggled to write his response now. "I believe your people would call me a vampire." I shuddered and took a step back, my hands instinctively shielding my throat. His gaze followed mine sadly, and he confirmed, "Yes, we drink blood. But I'm not like that. I'm what you'd call a vegetarian. I only hunt animals, not humans. But the want is still there. For nearly 90 years now I've denied that thirst." My eyes grew wide with shock. His mouth quirked at my reaction, and he continued, "Yes, I am actually 104 years old. You didn't think you were older than me, did you? Though I suppose you could have thought that, and I'd be none the wiser. You're an enigma to me, Mina. Your husband, him I can understand. I can hear his thoughts and his opinions about me. But you, I can read every mind except yours. I've asked myself why, but I've realized I don't care anymore." My head was already reeling, so the revelation that he could read others' thoughts barely perturbed me. He shook his head and continued, "Oh, Mina, your scent. How do I describe it to you without frightening you even more?" I waited, watching him struggle for words. It was the most human he had ever appeared, just a young man attempting to convey his feelings. My heart grew calm at his distress, and I realized he was of no threat to me now. Instead, fear turned to pity. What must it be like to be that isolated and for so long? The closest thing he had to a community were the villagers, who lived in mortal fear of him. And what could he do to amend that? He finally found his words and continued, quote, "You see, every person smells differently, has a different essence. If you locked an alcoholic in a room full of stale beer, he'd gladly drink it, but he could resist if he wished to, if he were a recovering alcoholic. Now let's say you placed in that room a glass of 100-year-old brandy, the rarest, finest cognac, and filled the room with its warm aroma. How do you think he would fare then?" End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 267. Footnote 77. In the original book, Edward also compares Bella to his own personal brand of heroin, but I felt that would be a bit too far of an anachronism. I attempted to understand his analogy, coming to the conclusion that I was the cognac and he the drunk. I had no idea why I, of all people, should be cursed with a scent that would attract a vampire, but I quickly realized that I did not wish to know. I had come away from the castle merely wanting to discover what Edward was, and I had. Now that I had the information about his state as a vampire, I wanted nothing more than to go home and pretend this entire visit had never occurred. I tried to assume a placating face and a tender tone and urged, "Edward, I would like to go back to the castle now." His spine straightened and his head lifted. As he swung me upon his back again, he noted, "That's the first time you've called me Edward without me having to remind you." I nodded once, surprised at myself. I closed my eyes, hoping that this would aid in the nausea from the rapid pace Edward set. I could feel the same gliding sensation, and within a moment we were back at the castle. I did not stagger when I was set on the ground this time, and a thought entered my head as we approached the entrance. I asked, "You have lived well over one man's lifetime. Have you ever considered seeking an end? Finding peace?" He filled in the gaps at what I was too afraid to ask and confirmed. "There are few ways to kill a vampire. Quote, the only way to be sure is to tear him to shreds and then burn the pieces." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 398. I shuddered yet again at such a picture and pried no further until I thought about the gifts from the villagers. This ignited my curiosity enough to ask, "Then why did the villagers give me safety measures? Are you repelled by garlic?" He smiled and shook his head before answering. "Myth. Crucifixes? Myth. Communion wafers? Steaks? Myth and myth." Footnote 79. An interesting note here, Edward is using myth to describe something as fake, and he uses this word in Twilight as well in response to Bella's questions about being burned by the sun or sleeping in coffins. However, for our purposes as mythographers, he is also describing the mythology behind the Dracula version of a vampire. This duality in meaning was likely unintentional on Meyer's part, but still an interesting moment to read. I shook my head, confused by the villagers' fear. If Edward did not feed on humans, what was there for humans to be frightened of? Footnote 80. A valid question. However, there is no answer here. That is simply part of why Edward in Dracula won't work. We paused in front of the castle door, unsure how to proceed. I broke the silence, explaining what I knew had to be the only logical course of action. "I must tell Jonathan, and we must leave here at once. I know you are no threat to me, but I feel it would be unwise for me to linger, given the temptation I pose." Footnote 81. Mina's remark demonstrates what blood represents to Meyer's vampires: sex. She is a temptation because Edward wants to suck her blood, yet she is also a temptation because Edward is attracted to her. Edward nodded once, solemnly, and replied, "I believe that would be for the best. I would ask for a hug or a goodbye kiss, but I don't want to get overexcited." I looked away embarrassed and held out a hand. He grasped it firmly, but gently so as to not cause me pain. I shook it once and murmured, "It was a pleasure to meet you, Count Cullen. I do hope your transition to England is carried out with little discomfort. Perhaps when you arrive, you will find new acquaintances with which to keep you company." He smiled ruefully and answered, "I'm afraid there will be only one Englishwoman who I want to spend time with. Unfortunately, I believe she'll be otherwise engaged." I felt my cheeks redden again and withdrew my hand from his grip. As I entered the castle, I retorted, "I highly doubt that. There are many people to fraternize with in London." With that remark, I allowed the door to close. I wasted no time in finding Jonathan, but when I went to tell him the story, I found I could not. I could not allow myself to expose Edward's secret. Footnote 82. Draw whatever conclusions you want from this. I personally wrote it that way because Bella never tells anyone that Edward is a vampire, and I wanted to keep the continuity here with Mina. Therefore, all I was able to say was that I wished to leave at once. Jonathan began to make half-hearted protestations, explaining that there was still business to be conducted. Edward appeared behind him in a silent blur, smiling at me in a melancholy way. He said quietly, though still causing Jonathan to start, "I'm afraid I've changed my mind. I don't think I'll move to London after all. I fear there would be too much excitement for me there. I wouldn't be able to control myself." I knew what he meant. He wished to stay away so as not to be tempted to seek me out again. My heart ached again, this time from gratitude. He was allowing me to leave and live my life with Jonathan, with no temptation or outside influence from him. I smiled at Edward, attempting to convey the depths of my appreciation, then turned to pack. Jonathan attempted to change Edward's mind, doubtlessly afraid of returning to his employer, having lost his first real client as a solicitor. However, Edward would not budge on his stance, and within the hour we were loaded into the caleche from, my goodness, merely 2 or 3 days before. It feels as though months have passed since that first encounter. When we arrived at the mouth of the Borgo Pass, Jonathan helped me descend from the carriage as Edward placed our luggage beside us.
He shook Jonathan's hand once and explained the coach from before would be passing by in less than an hour. He apologized for summoning Jonathan all the way across the continent only to disappoint his business endeavor. When he turned to me, he did not move at all but merely murmured, "Take care of yourself, Mina. Thank you for your kindness to me." I nodded in response and watched as Edward mounted the carriage with grace I now knew to be supernatural. He spared one last glance at me, and when the wind blew my hair, he breathed in deeply. He smiled with 1,000 emotions crossing his face: grief, joy, loneliness, and comfort. Then he flicked the reins and disappeared into the pass to his castle. We watched him go, and when he turned the corner, I knew that was the last I would ever see of Edward Cullen. Twilight Preface. Quote, "I'd never given much thought to how I would die, but even if I had, I would not have imagined it like this." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 1. Lying in a hospital bed, cold, weak, frail, the result of a fast-moving, inexplicable illness that the doctors can't diagnose and therefore can't treat. My mother and father sitting next to me, their mutual agreement to avoid each other temporarily dissolved for my benefit. Footnote 84. In the novel, Bella thinks this preface while a vampire named James is about to kill her. However, in this version, she will experience a similar fate to Lucy and Dracula, and therefore will waste away rather than be killed swiftly. That's not how Dracula operates. Quote, "I knew that if I'd never gone to Forks, I wouldn't be facing death now." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 1. Looking back, I tried to think if there was anything I could have done differently. But at each juncture, each decision, I couldn't think of any other way this could have played out. I suppose that was a comfort at least, to know I wouldn't change anything even if I could. "She's fading," I faintly heard my nurse say to my parents. My mother snatched my hand into hers and pressed it to her face, sobbing. My father, usually so stoic and unreadable like me, allowed a single tear to trickle down his cheek. The nurse was right, I was fading. I could feel my heart slowing down, the little blood I had left in my veins stilling from exhaustion. I guess this was it, the end of my time at Forks. It was 75 degrees in Phoenix when my mother drove me to the airport towards an awaiting plane that would carry me to Seattle, where another, smaller plane would fly me to Port Angeles. There, my father, Charlie, would be waiting for me in his police cruiser to drive me an hour to Forks, an inconsequential town in the Olympic Peninsula of northwest Washington state, whose only achievement was being the most rained-on place in the United States. I'd spent every summer there until I was 14, finally forcing Charlie to take me to California instead. Quote, "It was to Forks that I now exiled myself." End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 4. I hated Forks, but I loved my mother more. Her marriage to Phil had been a long time coming, and I could tell she wanted to travel around with him while he jumped from one minor league baseball team to another. I would just get in the way of that. But how could I leave her? Quote, "How could I leave my loving, erratic, harebrained mother to fend for herself?" Of course, she had Phil now, so the bills would probably get paid, there would be food in the refrigerator, gas in her car, and someone to call when she got lost, but still. End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 4. Footnote 87. An implicit message in Twilight is that it is natural for teenage children to care for their parents. We see Bella has been mothering her own mother for a while now, and later she will mother her father too. This is treated as normal and barely discussed. However, her parents' inability to care for themselves or for her will be a factor in Bella's downfall later. We arrived at the airport, found my terminal, and went through the routine we'd gone through 1,000 times now. "Bella," my mom said, "you can come home whenever you want. I'll come get you if you need me to." But I could tell, even as she promised, that she hoped that would not be the case. So I lied. "Don't worry," I urged. "It's gotta be great. I love you." She hugged me, then I boarded the plane. Now alone with my thoughts, I racked my brain for what I could possibly talk to Charlie about for an hour in the car. By the time I arrived, I still had no ideas. "It's nice to see you, Bells," he said, quote, as he automatically caught and steadied me, end quote, after I stumbled off the plane. Meyer, Twilight, page 5 through 6. Footnote 88. Bella has very few personality traits, but her clumsiness is a major one. Nice to see you too, Dad. I wasn't allowed to call him Charlie when I talked to him. All my bags fit easily in the trunk of the cruiser. After all, I didn't have many clothes that would withstand Washington's weather. I'd have to buy more soon, but right now I was saving for a car. I refused to ride around with flashing red and blue lights and sirens announcing my arrival. We both stared straight ahead as Charlie drove, neither of us particularly verbose. He was the first to break the silence. I found a good, really cheap car for you. I'll admit, it's pretty old, likely late 50s, early 60s, but it runs great. I bought it from Billy Black. Do you remember him? From La Push? La Push is the small Indian reservation near the coast, and no, I did not remember Billy Black. Why is he selling it? I asked, suspicious. He's in a wheelchair now, so he can't drive anymore. I nodded. At least the sale wasn't because the car was junk. How cheap is it? I inquired. That was the thing I couldn't budge on, after all. Well, honey, I sort of already bought it, as a kind of homecoming present. That took me by surprise. Free was always a win, though, so I just thanked him, then settled back into uncomfortable silence. When we arrived, I was surprised to find I actually liked the car. Well, not a car, but a truck, a big red one made of such solid iron it would take a snowplow to dent it, a welcome defense from my clumsiness. Wow, Dad, I love it. Thank you. At least my first day at school tomorrow wouldn't begin with a ride in the cruiser. Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you like it, Charlie said, embarrassed by my thanks. We got all my bags into my room in one trip. Quote, one of the best things about Charlie is he doesn't hover. End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 9. Footnote 89. Doesn't have hover is a bit of an understatement. Even in the original novel, Charlie is barely around. He left me to unpack on my own, and it was a relief to not have to smile. The ability to stare dejectedly out the window and let a few tears escape was welcome. But I would save my total meltdown for bed when I thought about what tomorrow held. At school, I would be the new girl from a big city in a sunny desert state. Maybe if I looked like a girl from Phoenix, it wouldn't be so bad, but I wasn't tan or blonde or sporty. Footnote 90. Bella's low self-esteem is imperative for her relationship with Edward to work. She attaches her entire self-worth to him throughout the novel. Her inability to have confidence in herself and her actions allows her to be manipulated very easily. In the bathroom, I examined myself in the mirror. My ivory skin, brown hair, brown eyes. I was short, barely 5'4", slender, but soft, clearly not an athlete. Quote, maybe it was the light, but already I looked sallower, unhealthy. It wasn't just physically that I'd never fit in. End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 10. Footnote 91. In Dracula, Lucy is described as anemic, a trait which some hypothesize is what drew her to Dracula. While not outrightly stated to be anemic, Bella is often described as being pale, quick to tire, and frequently nearly passes out due to an elevated heart rate, so it's not a stretch to say she has a similar condition that will draw her to Dracula as Lucy is. I didn't relate well to people the same age as me. Who am I kidding? I didn't relate well to anybody. Even my own mother and I, who knows me better than anybody, was never exactly on the same page as me. Quote, maybe there was a glitch in my brain. End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 11. Footnote 91. Part of the reason Edward becomes such a mythic being in young adult literature is because Bella is the mythic archetype for a stereotypical young adult female protagonist. The low self-esteem, despite being obviously beautiful, Bella is asked out 3 times by 3 different boys in one day, and the teenage angst of feeling like nobody understands you appealed to millions of young girls. Meyer relied upon the fact that teenage girls would have low self-esteem and created a character they could project onto, along with a hot vampire boyfriend that would give Bella, therefore the reader, a sense of self-worth and belonging. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. When I arrived at school the next day in my new, or at least new to me, truck, I wondered if I was in the right place. The sign that read Forks High School assured me I was, but the buildings resembled matching houses with the accompanying landscape rather than a school. Quote, "Where was the feel of the institution?" I wondered nostalgically. "Where were the chain link fences, the metal detectors?" End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 13. Footnote 93. One reading the novel could make the argument that Bella is an adrenaline junkie who enjoys entering dangerous situations, as showcased here. I received a schedule, map, and slip of paper from my teachers to sign from one of the school secretaries and the building labeled Front Office. Then I got back in my truck and followed the arriving students to the student parking lot. Quote, "I was glad to see that most of the cars were older like mine, nothing flashy. At home, I'd lived in one of the few lower income neighborhoods that were included in the Paradise Valley district." End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 14. Bella is drawn to the Cullens' wealth as well, something that Dracula also possesses. Here, my vintage truck fit in just fine. I studied the map in my truck and shouldered my bag. Quote, "I can do this," I lied to myself feebly. No one was going to bite me. End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 14. Footnote 95. A bit of foreshadowing that is entirely undone by the fact that the book jacket already tells the reader that Edward is a vampire. I sighed and exited the truck. I kept my hood up, trying to blend in with the crowd of teenagers. My breathing approached hyperventilating as I entered the building marked with a 3 and did not calm down until I was safely seated in the back of the classroom by my English teacher, Mr. Mason. I'd hoped my position in the back would keep classmates from staring at me, but somehow they managed. I kept my eyes fixed on the reading list of fairly basic authors that I'd already read: Bronte, Faulkner, Shakespeare, Chaucer. Footnote 96. Bella is not necessarily academically gifted, rather, she has already completed most of her assignments in past classes. When the bell rang, a boy with skin problems and black hair leaned across the aisle to ask, "You're Isabella Swan, right? Chief Swan's daughter?" "Bella," I corrected. Everybody who hadn't already left, which was most people, turned to look at me. I blushed tomato red, wishing more than anything to go home. "Where do you go after this?" the boy asked. "I'm headed to Building 4, so I could probably show you where to go if you'd like." I checked my schedule reluctantly. History and Government, with Dracula, in Building 6. Footnote 97. Dracula shows an interest in many subjects in his library, but a particular interest is placed on history, geography, and politics, so that is what he is teaching here. Also, Dracula is shown multiple times as being out and about in the sunlight without any ill effects. He does quote unquote sleep during the day in the novel, but our modern idea that a vampire cannot enter sunlight is actually a misconception of the vampire hunter Dr. Van Helsing in the novel, and the notion that they are burned by sunlight comes to us from the 1922 film Nosferatu. The boy's smiling face drooped a bit. The curious stares turned uncomfortable, especially the girls. One girl, I think her name was Lauren, turned white and frantically packed up her stuff. I was confused by this reaction. What could possibly be so terrible about my next class? "Oh, yeah, that's not super close to where I'm going, so I can't help you there. But I'm Eric, by the way. Maybe I'll see you at lunch." I nodded as he slid out of his chair to the door. Two girls sitting a couple rows ahead of me were frantically whispering to each other and throwing glances back at me as I packed up my bag. Finally, they rose and approached me. "Isabella?" the shorter one asked. "Just Bella," I repeated. She nodded once and tried to smile. The other girl remained impassive. "Hi, I'm Jessica, and this is Angela." I tried to smile at them both, but I'm sure it looked more like a grimace. Jessica wasn't deterred, though, and continued. "Yeah, so we're in that class too, and thought we might walk you there. We think we should, I don't know, I guess prepare you for the count." Footnote 98. Jessica and Angela do try and keep Bella from being alone with Edward until she assures them she is comfortable with it, so I feel they would also be the ones to look out for Bella in this context. I furrowed my brow in confusion as I rose from my chair and slung my bag over my shoulder. "The Count?" I repeated. "What's that supposed to mean?" Angela and Jessica shared a solemn glance. "It's what the students call Mr. Dracula," Angela answered as we left the building. We walked down the sidewalk to Building 6, and I could see that Eric had lied, as Building 4 was clearly right next to our destination. Jessica chattered as we walked. "Mr. Dracula is weird." Like, really weird. And when we try to talk about him, sometimes it feels like he's. Ugh, this is gonna sound crazy. Like he's listening, okay? So we just started calling him the Count. Once you meet him, it'll make more sense. There wasn't time for any more information. We'd arrived at Building 6. Jessica opened the door and entered, followed by Angela, then me. And they were right, I did need a warning, and the nickname did make sense after I saw Mr. Dracula. He was tall, taller than Charlie, and seemed on the verge of retirement. His fingers flipped through the pages of a textbook, his nails long and sharp, making small scratching noises against the papers. He had a strong, aquiline face, and his nose was shaped oddly, being very long and thin with arched nostrils. He had thick white hair growing profusely except for the temples, and similar white hair grew into a long mustache that framed his cruel mouth. A strong chin jutted out underneath it. His ears came to points like an elf's, and his cheeks were thin, allowing his cheekbones to protrude almost unhealthily. I should have been extremely surprised by the fact that he was paler than I was, paler than anybody I'd ever seen, actually. But that was only an afterthought, because the most striking features about Mr. Dracula were his eyes and mouth. His eyes were a burning, glowing red, and his lips were unnaturally red too, though perhaps they only appeared that way against the colorlessness of his skin. His clothes were entirely black, from the dress shirt, waistcoat, suit jacket, slacks, and shoes. The most peculiar part of his outfit was the black cloak he wore. Footnote 99. No Bela Lugosi here. Dracula is described as he is in the book. I could see why the students called him the Count. He resembled some sort of European nobility for sure. I froze in the doorway, suddenly unable to move upon seeing the teacher. He looked up from his book, and his cruel mouth twisted into a smile that revealed two sharp canine teeth. They were so long I just noticed they even protruded over his red bottom lip when they were closed. His smile was off-putting, yet somehow inviting. Footnote 100. Dracula is a master manipulator and makes Jonathan Harker in the novel feel very much at home, even when he actively thinks Dracula wants to cause him harm. He would likely be able to do so with Bella too. "Welcome to my classroom!" he exclaimed. Quote, "Enter freely and of your own will." End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 42. Footnote 101. This strange welcome likely stems from the fact that Stoker's vampires cannot enter a place without first being invited in. We see later that Dracula needs only to be invited in once, and after that he may come and go as he pleases. His odd greeting, combined with the warmth in his smile, created a bundle of emotions inside of me, as I was both put off and assured. I entered the room and sat down, feeling Mr. Dracula's eyes follow me. When the last students trickled in, he rose and stated with strange annotations. Footnote 102. Dracula is described as speaking English with hardly any accent, unlike the over-exaggerated Eastern European accent given to him in the film. However, he is also said to speak with odd rises and falls. "You must be Isabella Swan." I let my hair fall as a dark curtain between my teacher and I, peeking at him hesitantly. And his enthusiasm for the lesson was a welcome respite from the gloominess outside. As we packed up, Mr. Dracula sat back at his desk. I was one of the last out the door and about to leave when he said, "Miss Bella, it has been communicated to me that I am required to sign a paper to signify that you did indeed attend my class. Would you be so kind as to produce that paper now?" I blushed, forgetting all about the paper I needed my teachers to sign in the craziness of the first day. I fumbled with my bag, and in my haste I pulled out the slip along with some of my folders and pencils, which fluttered and clattered to the floor. I leaned down to pick them up, and Mr. Dracula bent to help me. His hand, I was surprised to see, had hairs growing on the palms. His hand brushed against mine as we collected my things, and, quote, his fingers were ice cold, like he'd been holding them in a snowdrift before class. End quote, Meyer, Twilight, page 45. Footnote 105, both Edward and Dracula are ice cold. I instinctively flinched away, and unfortunately Mr. Dracula noticed. The atmosphere grew tense, and his eyes flashed red, as though angry. He handed my papers to me, though he kept the one he needed to sign. With a flourish, the signature was added, and I stuffed the paper back into my bag. I turned on my heel, not wanting to be late on my first day to my next class, when Mr. Dracula said, "It was delightful to meet you, Miss Swan. I look forward to our next meeting with bated breath." I nodded once, suddenly breathless. I needed to leave. Without another word, I bolted. The rest of school passed in a blur. I tried to stop thinking about Mr. Dracula, but I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of discomfort I felt. And to think I had been convinced he wasn't all that bad. Now I understood Jessica and Angela's anxiety. Mr. Dracula had the creep factor to him. The next day was better at school. Mr. Dracula never even addressed me outright. But it was 10,000 times worse after school. When I got home, I was happy to see Charlie had taken the grocery list I'd been writing off the fridge and actually purchased the ingredients I asked for. I hadn't seen Charlie all that much, honestly, since he left before I was awake most mornings and got back just in time for dinner in the evening. The few hours we were inhabiting the same house, we spent separate as he watched TV and I did homework or read. His initiative to buy groceries felt like a present of some sort. Footnote 106. Charlie never actually buys groceries in the book, Bella does. But I wanted to speed things up a bit and didn't feel we needed a scene where Bella goes to buy groceries. I decided to make a lasagna, feeling I'd earned a comfort food for surviving the first 2 days of school. I tossed a salad, popped the lasagna and breadsticks in the oven, then settled at the kitchen table to do homework while I waited. Footnote 107. Again, teenagers caring for their parents is treated as normal and not discussed. Charlie never cooks for himself. Eventually, I heard the tires of the police cruiser pull into the driveway, but was surprised by the slam of 2 doors instead of 1. I rose and peeked out the window, horrified to see Mr. Dracula approaching the house with Charlie. I contemplated running upstairs and hiding, but what explanation could I possibly give for that behavior? Instead, I steeled myself and waited standing by the table. Charlie unlocked the door as he entered. I could hear him say, "Welcome, Mr. Dracula. Come on in." Footnote 108. Just like that, Dracula has access to the Swan Hole. "Thank you ever so much, Chief Swan. I'm most appreciative of your help in my hour of need." "That's what I'm here for. I'm honestly kind of surprised, though, to hear some people broke into your house. That sort of thing doesn't happen too often around here." Footnote 109. This is a lie fabricated by Dracula to gain access to Bella. "Of course, and what a testament it is to your leadership in our law enforcement that petty crimes and home invasions are so rare. Indeed, I too would be incredulous at such an accusation. However, as I am sure you are aware, though I do not wish to imply or self-aggrandize, I do possess to my name a fortune of no small means left to me after the passing of a dear uncle from Europe." Footnote 110. Obviously, Dracula was not left this money, but we can see in the original novel that he does indeed possess a fortune. "I am sure such inducements could tempt foolish youths into transgression, for I am sure you have found in your many years of service such misdeeds have been committed for less. I also live out in the remote part of the woods to the east of town, and I have no neighbors that would raise an alarm or witness the invasion. I suppose I am quite an easy target for petty crimes such as this, and I suppose I should count myself fortunate that I was working on restoring the other building on my property when the invasion occurred." Footnote 111. We'll see this other property later. Dracula is drawn to dilapidated residences, but he doesn't list it as his primary residence as to avoid suspicion. Charlie and Mr. Dracula entered the kitchen then, and I tried to smile nonchalantly. "Hey, Bells," Charlie greeted. "You know Mr. Dracula. His house got broken into last night, and while I've got some of the guys looking at it, I thought he could come over here to wait. I figured you wouldn't mind." Actually, I minded quite a lot, Charlie, but I could hardly say that with Mr. Dracula standing right next to him, smiling serenely at the domestic scene before him. So I just nodded and replied, "Of course, the more the merrier." Charlie nodded and stated, "I'll be right back. I'm going to change out of the uniform." I didn't want him to leave me alone with Mr. Dracula, but having no other choice, I nodded my understanding and plopped back down at the table, training my eyes on my homework. Mr. Dracula lowered himself in the chair to my right. I was just glad I was working on math and not anything from his class. He said nothing at first, which was fine by me, but finally he asked, "What do you now work on?" I didn't look up, allowing my hair to once again form a curtain between us. Math, I replied bluntly. He leaned forward to view my work, and when he did, I caught a whiff of his breath. Quote, it may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which, do what I could not conceal. End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 47. Footnote 112. Bad breath is a common folkloric belief about vampires. It was a more recent addition to claim vampires did not even need to breathe, as seen in Twilight and in the TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He seemed to notice the shudder that passed through me and leaned back in his chair. I realized I was gripping my pencil so tight it was nearly snapped, and when the oven timer went off, I jumped and broke it completely. I leapt from my chair and began to withdraw the food from the oven. Charlie entered the kitchen then, sniffing the aroma in the air. I'd never been so glad to see him. It smells great, Bells, he complimented. Mr. Dracula, would you like some?
No, I pray you continue without me. Quote, you will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you, but I have dined already and I do not sup. End quote, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 44. Footnote 113, Dracula does not ever eat human food. In fact, one of Mina's transition markers found in Dracula is her aversion to food. I cleared my homework off the table and loaded up Charlie's plate, then my own.
We ate in awkward silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware. Outside, sunset turned to night, and in the distance a wolf howled at the moon. It was joined by another, and another, until it seemed an entire choir of wolves was howling. Footnote 114. Werewolves admittedly do not appear in the first book for the most part. However, they play such a prominent role in other books and are sworn enemies of the vampires in Meyer's universe. I felt they needed to be added, especially when you consider their stance as enemies is completely mitigated by Dracula's ability to control wolves. Also, the werewolves are some of the few people to actually know about the existence of vampires and are needed for exposition purposes. Mr. Dracula's red eyes lit up, and he rose to look out the window at the moon. He said, quote, listen to them, the children of the night, what music they make. End quote, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 47. I shared a glance with Charlie, both of us confused by the comment. Just how abnormal could Mr. Dracula get? He turned back to us and stated, I have trespassed on your hospitality for too long, I fear. I shall return to my own home now, and I thank the both of you for your many kindnesses. Chief Swan, you have my eternal gratitude for your investigation and such generosity so as to open your home to me. I will not forget such geniality. Indeed, I should like to make a donation to your police force for, pardon my bluntness, I noticed your current police cruiser appeared to be getting on in years. No, my good sir, I will not accept argument. I shall visit the station tomorrow to make my donation. Miss Swan, I thank you for your company and look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow. Adieu. With that, he was gone. That night, I had a nightmare. I couldn't sleep at first because there was a strange flapping noise by the window. I peeked out and saw it was only a large bat buffeting its wings. Footnote 116. Dracula can turn into a bat. I opened the window to shoo it away, and it disappeared into thin air. Footnote 117. Dracula can become incorporeal at will at night, one of the only powers we see dependent on whether it is night or day. I shook my head, sure I must have just missed it, closed the window, and went back to bed. As I lay down, I saw what looked like a circling cloud of dust approach me. Footnote 118. Dracula uses this technique to hypnotize Jonathan, Lucy, and Mina in the novel. Important note, Bella should probably be immune to this power since she's immune to vampires' powers in Twilight, except when she isn't. Both Alice and Jasper are able to use their abilities on her, but this plot hole is never discussed or rectified in the novel. So I'm going to exploit it to say that Dracula can use his hypnotism ability on her, like Alice and Jasper can use theirs. It moved in a hypnotic rhythm, and I found that I could not move or speak. I watched the cloud grow closer and closer, my panic building, and then I must have fallen asleep because I could not remember anything else. When I woke up, it was morning. I felt more tired than before. Only 2 days of class, and I already felt wiped out. I got up begrudgingly and headed to the bathroom. I looked awful, or at least worse than usual. My skin was a great deal paler, and I must have scratched myself during the night because there were 2 small pinpricks on my throat. I tried to go about my morning routine, but it was difficult due to my fatigue. I was just glad Charlie had already left. I wasn't in the mood for an awkward wellness check after he saw my appearance. I just hoped nobody at school would notice. Of course, I was wrong. Jessica, Angela, Eric, another classmate named Mike, basically everybody asked me if I was feeling all right. I tried to explain that I felt fine, but my entourage still twittered around me like worried mothers. One positive was that Mr. Dracula was gone. The substitute told us he was dealing with a personal matter right now, and I felt both proud and distressed to know what the reason was. Footnote 119. Bella thinks it is because Dracula's home was broken into. In reality, he was rejuvenating his strength and youth by resting after he fed. I didn't spread the rumor, though, even as my classmates started questioning what the personal matter could be. I may have moved to a small town, but that didn't mean I had to start contributing to the rumor mill. At least we don't have to deal with the Count today, Jessica muttered to me. I nodded in agreement, happy to have a day without his red eyes following me. When I got home, I was surprised to see Charlie was already there, along with a car I didn't know. I panicked for a moment, wondering if Mr. Dracula had come back over, but when I entered the door, I heard Charlie and another man that was definitely not my teacher laughing. When I went into the living room, there were 2 Native American men with long black hair sitting down. One was older and in a wheelchair, so I guessed he must be Billy Black. The other I realized was a teenager, maybe even younger than me, and the resemblance between them told me he must be Billy's son. Bella! Charlie exclaimed. Come on in. You remember Billy Black? I smiled at him and replied, I should hope so, given that he sold us the best car in town. Billy laughed at my joke and responded, If best and oldest mean the same thing, then yeah, I sold you the best car in town. I'm glad you like it though, Bella. It's wonderful to see you again. Do you remember my son, Jacob? I looked to the boy, who smiled at me warmly. I couldn't say I remembered him, but I recalled playing with his sisters back when we were really young. If I squinted at Jacob, I could just make out the face of a younger brother trying to play with his older sisters and me. A bit, I admitted. How are you? Fine, thanks, Jacob replied. Billy and Jacob just stopped by to see you, ask how school was going, Charlie explained. School's fine, I answered, not really wanting to elaborate. Who are your teachers? Billy asked nonchalantly. Mason, Dracula. Dracula! Billy interrupted. Footnote 120. Billy hates the Colons in Twilight, and he would have reason to hate Dracula as well here, as the Quileute tribe were sworn enemies of vampires. All amusement fled from his face. He looked dead serious now. Yeah. Why? Billy looked at Charlie severely and hissed, I told you not to trust him. Charlie looked both uncomfortable and peeved. I know you've got your beliefs about him, Billy, but so far he hasn't given me any reason to. Has he come here? I looked between the 2 men, confused. I found Jacob's gaze as well, hoping he could illuminate me. He appeared embarrassed by his dad's outburst more than alarmed, and gave me an apologetic shrug. Has he come here? Billy repeated, this time almost shouting. Charlie hesitated one moment longer, then replied, Yes, last night, but really, Billy, don't you think you're Bella, Billy said, addressing me suddenly and swiveling his wheelchair away from Charlie. How are you feeling today? I paused, confused by the shift in subject, and answered, Well, I felt sort of fatigued this morning, but I think it may just be me adjusting to school and the move. Billy eyed me unbelievingly, and I avoided Charlie's concerned gaze after my confession. Billy finally said, Come, Jacob. We need to go back to the reservation. But we just got here, Dad, Jacob protested, looking at me. You can talk to Bella later, Billy stated in a tone that brooked no arguments. Jacob and Billy disappeared out the door before Charlie could start grilling me. I said, Dad, don't worry, I'm fine. I just need a bit more sleep, is all. I don't think I'm up to cooking, though, so would you be okay with leftovers tonight? Charlie nodded and replied, Of course, Bells, just rest and feel better, yeah? I smiled reassuringly and headed upstairs, suddenly exhausted. I tried to do my English homework, but reading Shakespeare was impossible at the moment. I went downstairs and endured a silent dinner with Charlie before heading to bed. When I lay down, I thought I heard a wolf howl far off in the distance. Suddenly, another joined it, closer. Then another and another, each growing in volume. I rose and peered out my window, shocked to see a gigantic black wolf standing outside my window. Footnote 121. In Twilight, turning into a werewolf occurs as follows. The Quileute will smell a vampire scent, and an unknown force will determine how many werewolves are needed to fight the vampire, and activate a gene in that many tribe members. The transition is then similar to puberty, as the shapeshifter will experience mood swings, growth spurts, a rise in body temperature, etc. Werewolves attempt to protect Bella in the original books, and they would protect her now at Billy's urging. Jacob is one of the last to shift, and he does not shift until the second book. Two more, a brown and a gray one, stood in the tree line across the street. They howled, then the one standing beneath my window. I should have been terrified and crying to Charlie, but instead I felt strangely safe. I got the feeling they weren't here to harm me, but to protect me. I headed to bed, confused but not uneasy. I slept fitfully for an hour or two before waking up. There was silence outside, not a howl to be heard. I looked to my window and saw that it was opened. Perhaps Charlie had opened it. Footnote 122. Dracula is able to compel people. He compels Lucy's mother in the original novel to remove the garlic in her room and open her window. Similarly, he could compel Charlie or Bella herself to allow access into the house. I rose and went to my vanity mirror, wanting to see if I looked better. My skin was still pale, but looked on the mend. I could see the dark shape of my bed and dresser in the background. When I turned around, though, standing in front of my bed was Mr. Dracula. Footnote 123. Stoker's vampires don't appear in mirrors. One folkloric belief is that mirrors reflect the soul, and vampires do not possess a soul, therefore cannot appear in reflections. In Dracula, notes indicate he also cannot be photographed and appears almost semi-transparent in certain lights. I opened my mouth to scream, but I froze. It felt then that I couldn't move, I couldn't think, I couldn't do anything at all. Mr. Dracula smiled, not the warm, inviting smile I'd seen him use, but a cold sneer of victory. My heart beat wildly in my chest, and I trembled in fear as he approached me. His wretchedly cold hands and long, sharp nails dug into my arms as he guided me back to my bed. I couldn't fight back. My muscles were frozen, except for where he forced me to move. I was plopped back into my bed on my back, and the cloud of dust began swirling again. My eyes, though I fought to keep them open, began to droop, and the last thing I remembered was Mr. Dracula's sharp teeth descending towards me. The next morning, my wish for recovery went unanswered. Instead, I felt worse. My first thought was about Mr. Dracula and his appearance in my room. Looking back, it felt like a horrible nightmare. Perhaps that was all it was, just a nightmare, and that's why I felt so wiped out. My energy was totally gone to the point that I didn't know if I could force myself out of bed. For the first time, I wished Charlie was there to check on me. I couldn't bear constant attention, but even just a quick acknowledgement that I was sick would have been nice. I could have stayed home then. As it was, without a parent's note, I doubted I could get away with skipping school. I trudged to the bathroom and gasped at my reflection. If I'd looked pale yesterday, I looked downright ghostly today. My skin was as white as paper, there were bags under my eyes, and the two pinpricks on my throat were irritated, red, and bigger than yesterday. When I opened my mouth in horror, I could see my canine teeth seemed longer, like I'd gotten them filed at the dentist or something. Footnote 124. How one becomes a vampire in Dracula is unclear. Van Helsing describes the process, yet Lucy's and Mina's transitions do not follow that pattern. In the novel, Van Helsing says anybody who is bitten by a vampire will become one, but this cannot be true or else the world would be overrun with them. He also says if someone who is bitten by a vampire dies during the day, they will not become a vampire, but if they die at night, they will. This is proven incorrect by Lucy as she dies during the day but still becomes a vampire. We will see later there is also a step present in Mina's transition but not Lucy's, in which Dracula forces Mina to drink his blood as well after he drinks hers. This is one of the most overtly sexual exchanges in the novel, as the transference of bodily fluids is what finalizes Mina's transition, and she considers herself unclean after the exchange. My gums were drawn back and pale, making the teeth look even longer. I realized with horror they were beginning to resemble Mr. Dracula's teeth. I questioned my previous assumption that it had been a nightmare. That cloud of dust had appeared 2 nights in a row now, and 2 nights in a row I had woken up feeling horrible and looking pale as a sheet. I resolved to go to school, and if Mr. Dracula wasn't there again, I would tell Charlie. What, exactly? That I suspected Mr. Dracula had broken into our house the past 2 nights, with neither of us the wiser? That I thought Mr. Dracula was doing something to me that was causing me to be sick? And even if I did have an explanation, would Charlie believe it? He'd been upset with Billy, someone he's been friends with for years, for his suspicion. How much easier would it be for him to brush off mine, a daughter who has avoided him and who he barely knows? I got ready in a blur, groaning with each exertion, and somehow made it to school. My classmates' concern tripled upon seeing me, and in English class I heard Jessica mutter to Angela so quietly I clearly wasn't meant to hear. "Remember Stacy last year? Same thing happened to her, and after a couple days we heard she died." My muscles stiffened. A girl died? And I was showing the same symptoms? This was news to me. I kept quiet, though, too tired to even ask for more details, and allowed Jessica and Angela to walk me over to history. My heart pounded with each step as we approached the building. I didn't think I could face Mr. Dracula, but somehow, if he was absent, that would be even worse. 2 days of nightmares, 2 days of sickness, and 2 days of his absence. That couldn't be a coincidence. The door opened, I sucked in a breath, and I stepped inside. At the desk, the same substitute from yesterday sat. My heart dropped to my stomach, and I backed out of the classroom. Jessica and Angela followed me, their hands supporting me. "Uh, Bella isn't feeling well," Jessica explained to our sub. "Angela and I are going to take her to the nurse." The sub looked up suspiciously, but concern flooded her features upon seeing my appearance. "Yes, that might be best," she assented. I trudged towards the nurse's office with Jessica and Angela holding my arms. Inside, I was placed on one of those uncomfortable doctor beds with the crinkly paper over it. The nurse took one look at me and pulled some cookies and orange juice from a cabinet. "Oh dear, you look like you've lost a pint of blood. Did you go donate or something?" I shook my head, wanting all of a sudden to cry. The nurse's worry, my friend's worry, even the sub's worry was too much. The nurse pressed the cookie and the juice into my hand, but when I tried to eat and drink it, it tasted like sandpaper. Footnote 125, as stated earlier, aversion to food is a marker of the transition to becoming a vampire. I swallowed with great effort, my stomach twisting with nausea, and said, "I think these cookies are expired. They taste horrible." The nurse looked confused and replied, "They can't be. I just bought them yesterday." The door opened again, and I saw Mike helping Eric walk. There was a big scrape on his knee, with blood running down his leg. "Jim got a little crazy," Mike offered as an explanation, but I could barely hear him. I was just looking at Eric's leg. Blood usually made me queasy and feel like I needed to pass out, but the cookies and juice had already done that. Now my nausea fled, and I felt hungry. Footnote 126. Lucy does try to suck her fiancé's blood before she dies in Dracula. A similar feeling will emerge here in Bella. It was the single most disgusting feeling I have ever felt. I tore my eyes from Eric and lay all the way down on the bed, focusing on the ceiling. I needed to tell somebody. I needed help. "Hey, Jessica," I began. "Did that girl, Stacy, did she say anything about the Count?" Jessica's face was concerned and confused. "Yes," she replied. "She said she thought he was doing something to her. She even went to the principal, but she had no evidence other than a suspicion. And the Count, well, he sponsors a lot of stuff at school and in the town." Footnote 127. Dracula uses his money for anonymity in the original novel. Here he uses it to avoid investigation. He paid for the new gymnasium last year and funded a new bell for the courthouse. Lots of the adults here think he's amazing because of stuff like that. The principal said Stacy was just being paranoid and the officials in town wouldn't listen either. I felt sick again. I think I need to go home. My dad isn't going to be there though, and I don't think he'd want me to go alone, so could you drive me out to the reservation? My dad's friend Billy Black is there, and I'd feel better being with some people. Sure, Bella, she replied warmly. Whatever you want. The nurse made me call Charlie before I left to let him know where I was going. I didn't want to, but if it got me out of school, I was willing to do anything. He answered on the third ring with, Charlie Swan here. I suddenly felt an intense urge to spill my guts and tell him everything. Tears pricked my eyes and I couldn't find my voice. Hello? He asked. What could I tell him? What could I say that he would believe? So I did what I was always horrible at. I lied. Hey, Dad, I began, my voice shaky. I just wanted to let you know I'm leaving school early. I'm a bit sick. Bells, are you okay? Do I need to come home? No, it's not that serious. I think I'm going to go to the reservation and stay with Billy until you get off work. Bella, if it's bad, I can leave. No, Dad, stay. I'll be fine with Billy. He hesitated for a long time, doubt evident even through the phone. Finally, he answered, Okay, if you're sure you're all right, I'll come pick you up from the reservation once we're done here. There was another break-in, this time at the funeral home, so it might take me a while. That's fine. I'll see you later. I hung up before he could respond. Before long, I was seated in Jessica's tiny car and headed to the reservation. We drove in relative silence, my head drooping against the window. I just wanted to sleep. Once we arrived, Billy, Jacob, and a few others I didn't recognize immediately flocked to the car as if they'd been waiting. Bella, Billy said as Jacob helped me out of the car. I could barely stand on my own, and one of the other men picked me up, cradling me against his chest. Jacob and Billy stared at me, twin concern etched on their faces. What happened? Billy asked Jessica. She's been feeling bad for the past 2 days, Jessica explained. She looked sick yesterday, but today she looks on the verge of death. Billy thanked her for her help, and then she was gone. The man holding me carried me into Billy's house, followed by what seemed like the entire reservation. I was placed gently on a couch, and the others began discussing something heatedly. We have to do something about this, the man who'd carried me in seethed. When he rose his chin in defiance, his profile resembled the black wolf outside my window last night. Why are we not attacking? You saw what happened last night, another snarled. You saw what it could do. I couldn't control my own body. It was like the form didn't belong to me anymore.
Then we fight without shifting, a third boy offered.
And how do you suggest we do that? We are no match for it in this form. You three, I said, pointing at the three who had spoken. You were there. You were there last night. Billy looked at me appraisingly. She is perceptive. Yes, they were there last night, in their wolf form. They were trying to protect you from the cold one. Footnote 128. Bella does tend to notice supernatural things around her and can usually recognize the wolves in their human form and vice versa. I tried to wrap my head around what I was being told. These three men had transformed into wolves and tried to protect me from who I could only assume was the Count. What is he? I wheezed, not needing to specify who I meant. We all knew. Jacob's face turned to stone. Quote, blood drinkers, he replied in a chilling voice. Your people call them vampires. End quote. Meyer, Twilight, page 126. A chill ran through my already cold veins. That's why I was so pale and why I was so weak. I'd been losing blood to the Count. What should I do? I asked. Nothing, Billy said. You will stay here and get better. You will be safe here. Billy, the first man said. We can't assure that. And you can smell her, can't you? Footnote 130, Meyer's werewolves can smell vampires and vice versa. Bella is slowly shifting and the werewolves can smell it. It may be too late. As long as you stay out of your wolf form, he cannot control you. And as to her smell, we shall wait and see what is to be done. Footnote 131. This is, as we have seen, incorrect as Dracula can hypnotize people to do what he wants. However, Billy is acting like Van Helsing here, and he claimed inaccurate truths about vampires, so Billy's misinformed conjecture is in character. The man looked around to see if anybody else would take his side, then left angrily. Don't mind Sam, the second boy assured. I got the feeling he was the gray wolf I saw. He's just upset he couldn't stop the cold one last night. I nodded weakly, grateful to have people who hardly knew me offer their protection. Jacob sat on the edge of the couch and murmured, Don't worry, Bella. You're going to be fine. I smiled appreciatively and felt my eyelids closing. Finally, some restful sleep. I awoke to the sound of panting. My eyes opened to see the black wolf from the night before, Sam, standing over me. Footnote 132. Whether Dracula compelled Sam to shift or he shifted voluntarily, Sam's transformation isn't really the important part of this scene. I gasped and scrambled up, the sudden effort aching my muscles and joints. I turned and saw to the left of me Billy on the ground, his wheelchair flipped over, and blood from claw and bite marks pocketing his arms as if he had raised them in protection. I tried to scream, but before I could get more than a sound out, the wolf had snapped the back of my jacket in its teeth and flung me onto its back. Faster than I could see, we were running across the reservation, into the forest, past the highway, and far out of Forks. We arrived at a decrepit 3-story brick house overgrown with weeds, ivy, and thyme. Footnote 133. Dracula is drawn to older places. Even in England, he seeks out crumbling buildings to make his home. This is the other property he spoke of earlier. Tears had stained my cheeks as we ran and only grew stronger once I realized where we were. In one of the third-floor windows, the Count's face appeared. He smiled the same victorious grin he'd had last night and said, Bella! Welcome to my home! Then, in horrific fashion, his hands found the bricks outside the window and his whole body followed. His fingers and toes found places to grasp on the wall, quote, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings, end quote, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 75. He seemed an amalgamation of lizard, human, and bat. Once he reached Sam and I, he raised a hand and Sam's head rose with it. The Count lowered his arm slowly, and Sam's haunches followed, laying on the ground. The Count's cold hands found mine, and he lifted me from Sam's back with remarkable strength. The tears still hadn't stopped, but I could still see through them that the Count looked different. Footnote 135. The following is out of style for this tone, but I found the description Stoker gives so vivid and horrible, I wanted to include it in its entirety. Please indulge me. Standing before me was the Count, quote, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray, the cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever. Even the deep, burning eyes seemed set amongst swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He was like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. End quote. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 98. Footnote 136. As I said, vivid and horrendous. This is not an attractive, seductive being of untold power and beauty. Dracula is a parasitical monster whose actions are told with sexual undertones. What could this mean for our Victorian-era audience? I shuddered, disgusted by the sight of him. No, not him. This was an it. This was not mortal. Stay away from me, I tried to command, but it came out as a weak whimper. The Count's eyes burned hellishly bright red, and the grip on my hands grew tighter to the point of pain. My dear Bella, he murmured, you misunderstand. It is you who cannot seem to stay away from me. Footnote 137. Dracula is a manipulator, threatening and gaslighting Jonathan on multiple occasions. He'll do the same here. I looked at him horrified and replied, No, I don't want anything to do with you. But of course you do. Despise Fork so strongly, you seek out the only person in this wretchedly provincial town who could offer you an escape. You despise your own attributes, your appearance, your ineptitude, and therefore you are drawn to the one source in town that has the power and the willingness to aid in your transformation.
I shook my head, not wanting to hear this monster say what I'd harbored in my heart. How could he know these things? I felt invaded, like my own mind wasn't private anymore. I don't want that. I don't want your transformation. He appeared almost sympathetic then and breathed,
Oh, but do you not see? Do you not realize?
"It has already begun! You are metamorphizing, my dear. You are becoming more than what you are. The teeth, the perversion to human sustenance, the desire for blood. You do not deny that these match your experience." I was stunned into silence again. My brain spinned with confusion and fear, and my knees gave out. The Count's inhuman strength lifted me into his arms, but it didn't feel like when Sam held me earlier in the day. I'd felt safe and protected then. Now I felt unclean and endangered. "Come, I will show you my present for you, as a parting gift." Footnote 138. Dracula is also a bit of a sadistical torturer. We don't see much of this in the original novel, except for the beginning when Jonathan stays at his house. We shall see a bit of it here now. Though I knew it was impossible, I felt a glimmer of hope. A parting gift? Could it mean he was going to leave me alone? We stepped inside, and I was carried up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor. There were 5 doors here, 4 of them open. All used to clearly be bedrooms, but what lay inside now chilled my very soul. In all 4 rooms, a coffin lay on the ground with dirt lining the bottom. Footnote 139. Dracula is said to require dirt from his homeland to be able to rest, and we see him transport quote-unquote boxes of dirt that are large enough for him to sleep in the original novel. These coffins act as the boxes now. In the room where the Count had crawled out the window, there was a body-shaped indent on the dirt, and a look at the other 3 bedrooms showed me why. There were 3 women, one in each room and all dazzlingly gorgeous, laying in the coffins. They appeared similar to the Count, swollen and repulsive, yet beyond that horror I could see they were beautiful. Footnote 140. These women appear in the original novel and are meant to drink Jonathan's blood, though he escaped before they can. They refer to their blood drinking as kisses, and they are referred to in the notes as Dracula's family. One looked hardly older than me, and I realized with a shock that I had to be looking at Stacy. The Count allowed for no more ogling, though, and walked straight towards the one door that wasn't open. He placed my feet on the ground, though he supported me with an icy, revolting arm around my waist. He opened the door with the other hand, and I sobbed in despair at the sight within. Charlie had said the funeral home had been broken into, and now I saw what was taken. A new coffin lay in the room, a layer of dirt on the bottom with no imprint. It wasn't a parting gift, after all. It was a welcoming one. I was being welcomed into the Count's home in more ways than one. "Now, the last step on your journey to a new life." Quote, "You may as well be quiet. It is not the first time or the second that your veins have appeased my thirst," unquote, the Count whispered. Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 395 through 396. Footnote 141. Mina says the Count said this to her before sucking her blood for the 3rd time. Mina's blood is sucked 3 times. Bella's blood is sucked 3 times. They are undergoing a slow death and resurrection. His large hand clasped both of mine and pulled them up, forcing my arms above my head. His mouth descended to my throat, and I felt 2 sharp pricks. I did not think I had any strength left, but what little I did fled from me. It was impossible to say how long the horrible experience lasted, but when the Count pulled away, my own blood dripped from his sneering mouth. He licked his horrible red lips and muttered, quote, "And you are now to me flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin, my bountiful winepress for a while, and shall be later on my companion and my helper." End quote, Stoker, The New Annotated Dracula, page 396. He undid his cloak and opened the top of his shirt,
one long, sharp nail making a sudden slash against the chest. Blood began to spurt out, and the hand that was not holding mine found the back of my neck. I was forced downward, and my mouth pressed against the wound. I tried to thrash away, but the unnatural strength prevailed against my own weakened effort. I was forced between two equally abhorrent actions: to suffocate or to swallow. My animal-based action of self-preservation kicked in, and before I could think too hard, I had swallowed some of the blood. Black tinged the corners of my vision, and I vaguely heard the Count say, "Farewell for now, Bella. I look forward to our next meeting with bated breath." I awoke in the hospital. Charlie sat in the chair next to me, his head in his hands. For one awful, detestable moment, I considered crying to try and get him to hug me. Once he was close enough, I stopped myself, disgusted with my own thoughts. Footnote 143. It is common folkloric belief that a vampire's first victims are often their family. Instead, I just croaked out, "Dad." He looked up quickly, tears filling his eyes. I'd never seen him cry before. "Oh, Bella," he murmured weakly. His hands enveloped mine, and I found tears form in my own eyes in response. "We found you collapsed on the highway. You were so pale and hardly breathing, and Bella, I'm so sorry I wasn't there." I breathed shakily, realizing I had a nasal cannula in to assist me. It didn't seem to be doing a very good job, but maybe I was just that weak. "It's not your fault, Dad," I rasped. "How long have I been here?" "Over a day," he replied. "You were unconscious the whole time." The events of the night before came flooding back, and I asked quickly, "Billy Black, is he okay? I saw him—" Charlie's face crumpled, telling me all I needed to know. I felt a sob tear through my body. Billy had died trying to protect me from— "Sam, is Sam okay?" Charlie shook his head and answered, "We found him near the reservation. We're guessing he tried to chase off the wolf that attacked Billy, but he got attacked too." Footnote 144. Stoker implies in Dracula that the Count kills off the solicitors that helped him conduct his business and move to England, so less people know information about him or his existence. It is not a far leap to think he would do the same to Sam, who now knows where he lives, as people sometimes still remember their experience when hypnotized in the original novel. "I'm so sorry you were near all that, Bells. Is that why you were on the highway? Were you running?" I considered telling him the truth for a moment. But when I considered what he would do, what he would have to do, not only as my father, but as the police chief of Forks, I hesitated. How could I send him and his team of puny humans against the Count and his 3 companions? How could I send them into a lion's den with no protection? I would much rather keep him safe and stay unavenged than get justice by risking his life. Footnote 145. You can draw your own conclusions about whether Bella was really thinking this or if Dracula compelled her to lie. I was getting good at lying now anyway. "Yes," I answered. "Yes, I was running from the wolf." He nodded and assured, "We're going to find that monster." I closed my eyes and let the tears fall, knowing that they would be chasing a monster of myth and would never find him. A few hours later, my mom arrived, harried and stressed beyond anything I'd ever seen from her. She wouldn't let go of my hand and just kept apologizing for sending me here, even after I reminded her it was my choice. I didn't want to leave her feeling guilty. Time ticked on, tests were run, and the doctors told my parents quietly outside my room that my bodily functions were basically all shutting down. The machines were keeping me alive, but as soon as they turned off, I would be dead within a minute. Or at least, that was what I gathered. My will to live basically vanished. After everything I'd been through in just the past week, I wasn't sure how I could even continue living a life, even if I had the chance. How do you move past something like that? How could I ever hug my father without feeling the cold hands of the Count? How could I ever look into someone's eyes without seeing the hellish red of his? How could I look at myself in the mirror, knowing that I had engaged in such horrific behavior? No, it was impossible to move forward.
I was done. Maybe the Count was right in that regard. Perhaps I was just trying to escape. My mother and father held my hand. The nurses had shot me with something to ease my pain, ease my transition. All I could think was, please, please let me be done. Don't bring me back as a monster. Don't bring me back belonging to him. As I closed my eyes for what I hoped would be the last time, I heard a small voice in the back of my mind, too small to determine who it was or where it was coming from, say, "Come, I am waiting for you." Footnote 146. Believe whatever you wish about Bella's life after death. In Dracula, it is said that Lucy does not know what she does as a vampire. Perhaps that is what will happen with Bella, or perhaps she will become like Dracula and his three companions, cognizant of her actions and still committing murder. Or perhaps Bella is dying and the voice she hears is the voice of God. Meyer is a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints after all, so a higher power would not be out of character for this novel. It is up to you how the story ends. Conclusion. Overall, the last 40 pages or so was meant to convey a simple message. Vampires have changed, yet their mythicity has stayed the same. Dracula was written for a Victorian adult audience and meant to both thrill and terrify them. He is a monster and a parasite. This is not disputed. However, his monstrous and parasitic tendencies are given such powerful sexual undertones that one is both titillated and disgusted by them. They are fascinating but gruesome. Lucy receives blood transfusions from 4 different men, and her fiancé is not informed, as it would be scandalous and shameful. Mina feels she can no longer touch Jonathan after her tryst with Dracula. In this novel, blood equals sex, which equals shame, revulsion, and danger. Dracula is mythic because he exists in a taboo between life and death, human and monster, sexually active and fatally dangerous. He allows a Victorian audience to address concerns and fears about sex in a society that does not allow for much conversation about the topic. Edward Cullen was written for 21st century teenage girls to both attract them and validate them. He's meant to be sexy and romantic, this is not disputed. However, his sexiness and romance are given such monstrous, dangerous undertones that one is both attracted to and fearful of them. They are enticing, but threatening. Edward assures Bella he will not drink her blood, but is in constant danger of losing control and feeding on her. They are unable to get too physically intimate, as it could result in Edward allowing his vampiric side to win and cause devastating, irrevocable damages to Bella. In this novel, blood equals sex, which equals excitement, anticipation, and danger. Edward is well known in the current day and age for being a poor representation of a romantic partner and a poor excuse for a vampire, as much of the folklore and mythology that had been cemented for centuries was disregarded or altered for Edward. However, that is part of why he works. He is a new type of vampire, introducing a new mythic presence to the genre. Still, his presentation gives a 21st century female audience the ability to acknowledge the presence of sexual desire in women and address the fear and apprehension still associated with sex today. Both of these vampires are monsters. They have both killed and lied. Both of these vampires are given sexual undertones. However, it is quite Freudian to assume that these characters are merely representations of sex. They must be discussing something more. The switching of Edward and Dracula reveals one possibility for what else these characters represent. Their portrayal is nearly entirely dependent upon one necessity: the women they are involved with. The consent of the women is paramount to making these vampires work. Edward has consent, Dracula does not. Edward is appealing, Dracula is not. Without this crucial feature, Edward becomes just another stalking, creepy, unwanted vampire. With consent, Dracula becomes an, albeit older, romantic interest of more chaotic sexual love than the cosmic, genteel love of Jonathan or Arthur to Mina and Lucy. With consent, the environments and their reactions to vampires change too. The villagers are armed to the teeth to fight against Edward when they never needed to fight against him in the first place. Forks is ill-equipped to deal with a vampire, and Bella dies because of their inability to protect her from Dracula, who ignored her wishes. These stories can be read a million different ways with a million different messages embedded within them. However, when one puts them in conjunction with each other, when one considers their audiences, their purposes, their plots, one can find the importance of female consent in regards to the male vampires and its role in allowing them to gain mythicity. Dracula's mythic purpose is to act as a representation of rape for a Victorian audience that wasn't really allowed to discuss such a delicate topic openly. Edward's mythic purpose is to act as a representation of female sexual desire in a day and age where women are still shamed for possessing these desires. So, yes, these vampires are symbols of sex, but it's never just sex. It's a conversation towards where men and women fall in terms of their relationships with sex, the necessity of female consent, and the allowance society permits for the discussion.